Good morning and welcome to the London Assembly's Mayor's Question Time. In accordance with government regulations, we are holding this meeting on a virtual basis with Assembly members and the Mayor participating remotely. Can I ask the Clerk, Rebecca Arnold, to confirm the names of the Assembly members who are virtually present at this meeting and any apologies for absence, please?
Chair, I can confirm that we have no apologies for absence. We have all 25 Assembly members present, namely Assembly Member Arnold, Assembly Member Bacon, Assembly Member Bailey, Assembly Member Berry, Assembly Member Boff, Assembly Member Cooper, Assembly Member Desai, Assembly Member Devonish, Assembly Member Dismore, Assembly Member Duval, Assembly Member Eshalomi MP, Assembly Member Gavron, Assembly Member Hall, Assembly Member Curtin, Assembly Member McCartney, Assembly Member Moore, Assembly Member O'Connell, Assembly Member Pigeon, Assembly Member Prince, Assembly Member Qureshi, Assembly Member Russell, Assembly Member Dr Sahota, Assembly Member Whittle, Assembly Member Arbour, Deputy Chairman, and yourself, Assembly Member Shah, Chair, and we also have the Mayor on the call as well.
That's brilliant. We have full house today. Everyone, once again, welcome. I'll start with the announcement from the Chair. Firstly, I'd like to start with an announcement congratulating Assembly Member Onkar Sahota for his election as the Labour's Deputy Mayor, Deputy Leader, as well as recognizing his role as Group's Manager and the Whip. Can I also provide an update on some recent Assembly activity? Firstly, a Black Lives Matter vigil for Assembly and Secretariat staff took place on Wednesday, 10th of June, which proved to be a remarkable event with inspirational contributions from staff, paving a way forward to positive change through ongoing work on anti-racism and the social justice agenda. Next one is the Police and Crime Committee wrote to the Metropolitan Police Service to find out how many police officers have completed unconscious bias training. They also wrote to the Justice Secretary on the current backlog of court cases in the Crown Courts. The Transport Committee met on Monday to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on the transport network in terms of safety and finances. And lastly, the Economic Committee met on Wednesday to discuss how COVID-19 has impacted businesses across capital. If you can move on to declarations of interests, can I ask the Assembly to note the recommendations set out on item 2?
Noted. Noted.
Thank you very much. Can I ask Assembly members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interests or any other relevant interests they have relate to the item on the agenda for today's meeting?
Noted.
There are none. Thank you very much. Minutes of the meeting. Can I ask the Assembly to confirm the minutes of Mayor's Question Time meeting held on 21st May 2020 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Right. Can I ask the Assembly formally to receive the Mayor's report covering the period 8th of May to June, 4th of June? The Mayor will now provide an oral update of up to 5 minutes on matters arising since the publications of his report. Thank you very much. Mr. Mayor, good morning.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Assembly members. COVID-19 is the biggest challenge our city has faced since the Second World War, and we're continuing to do all that we can from City Hall to prevent a catastrophic second wave of this deadly disease. One of the huge consequences is the devastating impact it's had on London's public finances, which were in good shape before the pandemic hit. TfL's income from fares has dropped by more than 90%, and income from local business rates and council tax has fallen off the cliff. That's why I warned yesterday that we'll be left with no choice but to make significant cuts across the mayoral bodies unless the government urgently acts to support local and regional authorities across the country. So I'd urge all Assembly members to join me and the many mayors and local authority leaders from across the political divide who are putting pressure on the government to do the right thing. Whatever happens, I'll do what I can to protect frontline services as much as possible, and it's only right that I should volunteer for an immediate pay cut and continue not to take any pension contributions in these extremely difficult circumstances. New budget guidance will be published shortly, and I'll keep the London Assembly and all Londoners up to date as this develops. I know millions of Londoners were horrified by the shameful scenes of violence and racism from members of the far right over the weekend. Our police officers did a fantastic job controlling demonstrators and preventing the situation from escalating any further. And I want to place on record, on behalf of all Londoners, my thanks and gratitude to our policemen and policewomen. More than 85 officers have been injured in the course of their duties over the last few weeks. Such violence will never be tolerated, and anyone who attacks our police or engages in acts of vandalism will always feel the full force of the law. I also, Chair, want to take this opportunity to reiterate my support for the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm proud to stand with millions of people around the world who are raising their voices and saying loud and clear that we must end the racism and institutional discrimination that sadly still exists in our society. And can I just be clear on one thing? We must not allow any kind of equivalence to be drawn between the members of the far right who came to our city for the sole purpose of sowing division and hatred, and the supporters of Black Lives Matter, anti-racists, the vast majority of whom have protested peacefully and have been excellent ambassadors for such a vital cause. I welcome the promise from the Prime Minister that the government will look at discrimination in our public institutions, but the truth is we already know what's needed from the many government reviews that have already been done. We don't need more delay. The time for action is now. Thank you, Chair. I've also been asked for 2 oral updates. With your permission, I'll go to them straight away. The first one is from Assemblymember Boff, who has asked about the Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm. I asked my Deputy Mayor for Culture and Creative Industries, Justine Simons, OBE, and Deputy Mayor for Social Integration, Social Mobility and Community Engagement, Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard, to urgently bring together arts, community and council leaders across the capital to create the Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm. The Commission will consider how we improve diversity across our public realm and how we tell a more accurate story of our city. The aim is to work in partnership with boroughs and communities to ensure our street names, squares and statues properly reflect our city's achievements and diversity. The terms of reference for the Commission are being drafted and developed in consultation with councils, community groups and other stakeholders. Within those terms of reference, I expect that the Commission will review what currently makes up London's public realm, further the discussion into what legacy should be celebrated and make recommendations as part of their work to establish best practice and standards. It will be wide in scope and consider commemoration, murals, street art, street names and memorials. There will be an open call for independent members of the Commission working in partnership with councils, communities and stakeholders across the capital. In the meantime, the Local Government Association has issued a useful advice note for its members outlining some approaches to reviewing existing statues and memorials. Chair, I've also had a request for an oral update from Assemblymember Berry in relation to arrests made during the protest this weekend. Like me, millions of Londoners will have been disgusted by the shameful scenes of violence, desecration and racism displayed by the right-wing extremists who gathered in our city this weekend. In the face of attacks and abuse, our police did a fantastic job to control the situation, and to them I want to say thank you. In total, 128 arrests have been made in connection to the disorder for a range of offences, including breach of the peace, violent disorder, possession of an offensive weapon, possession of Class A drugs, and being drunk and disorderly. Unfortunately, arrests also had to be made after 23 officers were injured. It is clear that far-right groups were intent on causing violence and disorder in central London. We will not tolerate violence, vandalism and attacks on our police, and perpetrators will feel the full force of the law.
Thank you. You also had another request for update on, oh yeah, sorry, you covered that very much. Okay, already have a list of members who have requested that they may want to come in with supplementaries. Can I start with Assembly Member Duval? Do you want to come in at this stage? Assembly Member Duval? Can you?
Chair, I've got a question later on the agenda. I don't want to abuse the position, but I mean there are some questions arising from the Mayor's report. I'd like to ask a couple of questions. Look, Mr. Mayor, thank you very much. It's right and responsible that we take early action if we can identify problems in terms of our budget. It just comes to mind, are we in a position of where we have articulated our assessments back to central government? Have we done it for the GLA group and family? And are we doing it with the London councils and other well, we are the other public services that are under financial pressure? And when, if we haven't done it, when are you able to share that with us?
Thank you, Senator Duval. So yes, we're talking regularly with not just MHCLG and other departments in government, including the Prime Minister's team, but also London councils. That includes the boroughs, but also City London Corporation, and also the Met Police Service, the London Fire Brigade, and the development corporations and other partners across London. And the key point to make, Senator Duval, and you'll know this from previous experiences, we received, roughly speaking, £3.4 billion from a combination of business rates and council tax. And the three big issues are, one is we have spent a huge amount in dealing with COVID-19 and our response. So our expenditure has gone up, including the expenditure of councils. The business rates, we know for a variety of reasons, they're obvious, that businesses pay has gone down. The government's given some relief to London, but doesn't meet the gap in relation to the business rate shortfall. But also we know that the estimates made by councils in relation to council tax this year will fall way short, because many families will now be in receipt of benefits rather than paying the full council tax. And so we are in conversations with the government, and one of the reasons why I was quite keen to make sure I forewarned Londoners about the scale of the challenges, to make sure Londoners were aware of what potentially could happen if the government doesn't step in to help us. And by the way, this is a challenge being felt across the country. So as recently as yesterday, I spoke to the Metro 9 who have similar challenges, and we're speaking to the LGA, who represent a number of councils across the country. You'll have seen, Senator Duval, during Prime Minister's questions, the exchange between the leader of Her Majesty's official opposition and the Prime Minister, where Keir Starmer pointed to a letter written from Conservative leaders expressing their concerns about this very same issue.
So, sorry, Mr. Mayor, can I just come back on you? I think, thank you for that answer, and that's very detailed. But what I'd like to know, when are we going to see the case for not just the technical case of the financial gap, but the case of why we should get that money in this particular time? I think of some really good reasons of why the government should not go down the austerity route. But I'm just wondering, when are we going to see that case for London being made, and when can we share that? It goes over and above the technical finances. We want money to fill this gap. I think it's a question of what we want the money for, because we'll be doing some continuing the same, but also we'll be meeting the new challenges of COVID-19 and the economic downturn. So I think I just want to see, just really press you a little bit further. When are we likely to see that case, and when will you share that with us and Londoners?
I hope to be able to share the draft budget guidance with colleagues, including Londoners, in the next week or two.
Chair, it's a bit more than the budget guidance I'm asking, Mr. Mayor. It's the actual case for us of why I think both me and you share that view of why we should have that money when we know we're going to be in an economic downturn, and what we would use that money for. And hopefully it might be in the budget guidance, but I thought it might be in a separate document. But thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Right. Assembly Member Hall, do you want to come in at this stage, or I've got you down for supplementary under Assembly Member Buff's update as well?
No, if I could just come in this
Sure.
once, Chair.
Yeah.
Can I nail you down, please, on this budget guidance? Clearly, there's an awful lot of work that's got to be done on this by the Budget Committee. You're saying in the next week or two, with our first meeting to look at this is 7th of July. I don't want the documents the night before, so we can't look at them properly. So can I pin you down, please? When will we have the budget guidance through?
As soon as we can. What I can do is, if it's not ready in final form, Senator Hall, I can try and make sure that you as the chair have got a draft version by next week. Does that work for you?
If I can have a draft one by then, please. And can I plead with you, please? We've been making budget amendments for the last 4 years. We found £113 million worth of savings in the last budget, which you didn't take. Will you start looking at that, please, as a matter of urgency? I'll leave it there.
I want if you play political games you've done over the last 4 years, but if you want to work sensibly across the political divide, of course, I'm always happy to work with colleagues. And when colleagues are sensible and not tribally political, of course I work with them.
Well, that's a silly comment, but I'm used to that. Thank you, Chairman.
I'm sure you are. We've heard lots of yours over the last 4 years.
Right. I have a
I've
number
only
of...
actually been here 3 years, Mr. Mayor. I've only actually been on the Assembly 3 years. Thank you.
Right.
It does feel longer.
Well, thank you. If you can stop there, please. Yeah. Okay. I have a number of other members who potentially indicated they want to come in. Not sure whether they are to do with the two questions raised by Assembly Member Boff and Assembly Member Barry. What I would ask Assembly Member Tony Devenish, did you want to come in on the update now, or do you want to wait for
yes,
the other two?
Yes, please, Chair, if I could. Thank you. Good
Okay.
morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning.
There's one issue I think in all seriousness you missed in your update, and that is job creation and job protection in London. So can I give you 2 examples where you have power to do something that will really help real Londoners? First is Rob Jenrick's letter to you of the 10th of June on shovel-ready projects, which I believe all mayors and LEPs have to respond by today. So my first question is, have you got that letter? Are you going to respond today? And can you send a copy to the Assembly, please, on shovel-ready projects to kickstart the economy? And my second point is, in terms of planning, you have recovered some of the largest job-creating large planning applications in recent weeks and months. When will you fix the date for these public hearings, please? And when will you put that on the GLA website? Thank you.
Can I thank the Senator for those really sensible questions. In relation to Robert Jenrick, just to reassure Senator Devenish, we've been working really closely together over the last few weeks, MHLG and City Hall, and Robert Jenrick in particular and myself. The letter will go today, and it does include a list of shovel-ready projects. I need to get permission from MHCLG, and if they're happy for me to make the letter public, I can do so. But at the very least, I'm sure they'll be agreeable to me and release it to the Assembly. So subject to them agreeing that, I'm very happy, Chair, to share that with the Assembly at least. But it does have a large list of shovel-ready projects, and you'll be pleased to know, because I know your interest as a constituency member, it does include Hammersmith Bridge as well, and the short-term funds that could really help in relation to that. In relation to job creation, the second question, you'll be aware of the difficulties with COVID-19. We are trying to set up these hearings virtually, and what I'll do is make sure, Chair, again with your permission, to let colleagues know when those dates are. But I was told as recently as yesterday, we have some dates penciled in. We've got to speak to the various parties to make sure it works for them. You'll be aware of some of the residents often, we're going to check they've got the facilities, but subject to those conditions, I'm more than happy to share, if at least a draft dates, just to reassure you, we are making progress, and our officers have worked really hard to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can I ask Assembly Member Whittle if he wants to ask any supplementary?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Mayor. I want to ask you about your new commission on diversity in the public realm. And I want to ask, because I've obviously looked at your press release. As far as I can see, there are no terms of reference as such formally yet. But I would like to know, where do you derive the authority to stand in judgment on London and British history? So far as I know, it was not in your manifesto. You have never mentioned it before. You mentioned at the very beginning of this that in fact we were in the worst crisis since the Second World War, and yet you choose in the middle of that bad crisis to actually introduce something which is divisive and which will in fact, I believe, encourage people who are already attacking our monuments around the country. What is your authority for setting up this kangaroo court, Mr. Mayor?
Well, I'm sorry some of them feels this way. I'll give one example of one of the ways that I've responded to campaign-run issues. So when I first became mayor, a campaign began from Caroline Credo Perez, who noticed there were 11 statues of great people in Parliament Square, but none of women. And so I responded to the campaign, and in 2018 was really pleased to unveil the first statue of a woman in Parliament Square, Millicent Fawcett, who sits there proudly in Parliament Square. And one of the things that I'm cognizant of is that a number of the public realm in our cities are under the direct control of the mayor. Some areas are like Parliament Square. Others are the control of councils or universities or the arts sector. And one of the reasons why we're setting up a commission is to get partners like council leaders, those in the arts world and others on board to look into whether the public realm in our city fully reflects the diversity of the contribution made towards our city. I'm sorry if he thinks it does, but my view and the views of many Londoners is it doesn't. And that includes issues like street names, public squares, murals, plaques. He'll have heard the announcement from English Heritage this week, who are reviewing their blue plaques to make sure they're reflecting the Assembly. Indeed, had a really good campaign. Janet Arnold, when she was chair, led a campaign to look at whether the plaques we have properly reflect the contribution of diverse Londoners, and the Assembly did a good job, I think, last year in trying to rectify that, and that was warmly welcomed by Londoners.
No, Mr. Mayor, this is straight out of the Maoist Cultural Revolution playbook, this stuff. You say in your press release that you will stand in, judge, jury and executioner on the various legacies which should or should not be celebrated. I would ask you, not very far from where we are, at the bottom of the Mall, there is a huge statue, iconic one, to Queen Victoria. Now, she was the very symbol of the Victorian London which you, in your press release...
Can you ask your question, please?
Yes, exactly. Will she be on your list? She was, after all, the very symbol of British imperial power in the 19th century. Will she be on your list? Will you be looking at her too?
Well, firstly, Chair, for the winners, I don't have a list. But I'd be astonished if anyone was seriously recommending that Queen Victoria's statue be removed.
Why not? Because it's anyone. Basically, you are so vague in this. You say anyone connected. We know that this is actually just the beginning of this, Mr. Mayor. We know what this is. This is the beginning of it. Because already we've got people saying we should take down the statue of Arthur Harris. All around the country, we're seeing people saying Francis Drake and this kind of thing. You gave encouragement, official encouragement. It's unbelievably irresponsible at the very height of a very, very tense situation.
Assembly Member Whittle, you made your point very clearly. Can you ask questions if you have any?
Sorry, Chair.
Right. I think let's move on to Assembly Member Buff. Do you want to have any follow-up on the question that you raised in the first place? I do apologize. I should have called you in before. Assembly Member Buff.
Thank you. No concerns, Chair. Will you consider adding social class to the list of those groups that need redressed representation?
That's a really good point. I'm sure the Commission will look into that. I mean, the Commission, not me, 15 independent members and the two deputy mayors will look into this. We're working on terms of reference, but I'll make sure that your suggestion is passed on to those working on terms of reference.
Will the Commission that will be looking into diversity be politically diverse itself?
I certainly hope so. It's really important we properly reflect our city's diversity, and that includes the point you referred to in relation to politics as well.
Along with adding to the public domain, will you consider removing monuments from it? And who will decide what criteria for considering removal? Who will decide what those criteria will be?
Well, I think this was your original question, Senator Roth, that I sought to respond to. None of this has been worked out because it's really important to take on board various views. You all have strong views, I'm sure. Please feel free to feed in your views to the two deputy mayors, but also to the independent members once they've been appointed. There'll be an open advertising process for for vacancies, you can apply to be one of those members, but I'm sure others will as well. So people will apply to be independent members of the Commission. The terms of reference will be worked on, but if there are any strong views you've got in relation to the points you've raised, please feel free to feed them in.
So are you saying that monuments will be considered for removal?
I don't see why they shouldn't be.
And how long is this Commission going to deliberate for?
Well, one of the things that we're going to do is for the Commission to work out a timeline. You'll be aware of the large amount of time that there needs to be, rightly so, in relation to formal consultations. Changing a street name is not straightforward, but also I'm well aware that a large number of streets in our city aren't under the control of City Hall. 95%, roughly speaking, are the controls of the boroughs. The boroughs, not unreasonably, will want to have consultations before they change street names or street squares, or English Heritage's process for blue plaque, for example, takes some time. So they have to work out a timeline in relation to any new statues being unveiled. From personal experience, for example, Millicent Forster took us about 18 months before she was finally unveiled as a new statue of Parliament Square. That's an example of a big statue in Parliament Square, really different to what could happen in squares and streets across our city.
And finally, Mr. Mayor, when the Commission makes recommendations, perhaps to boroughs, will those recommendations be effectively recommendations from the Mayor of London? Will you endorse their recommendations?
I should just distinguish. So the LGA have separately put out their guidance for local authorities because you'll be aware that local authorities are responsible for what happens on streets and space that are under the control of the local authority. We've got no power, nor would I think it's appropriate for us to force.
Mr. Mayor, that's not what I asked. Presumably the Commission is going to make recommendations. And those recommendations, will those recommendations effectively be from yourself as Mayor of London?
Well, it depends what they are.
So you will overrule recommendations that the Commission may make?
That wasn't your question. Your question was, would they have my approval? And so I'll have to wait and see once the Commission comes back with recommendations whether I approve them or not.
This Commission is semi-independent from the Mayor of London, and it is not about Mayor of London's decisions, it is about the Commission's.
Yeah, the best comparator at this stage is the fourth plinth. I'm not a judge in relation to the fourth plinth. And so there's a separate body of experts who come up with recommendations for what goes in the fourth plinth. That's been the case for some time. It's a really good system.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That's fine. You've answered the question. You're very kind. Thank you.
Assemblymember Hall, I have you down here. You may want to ask a question on this. No?
No, I'll leave it. Thank you.
Wonderful. No problem. Thank you very much. And lastly, Assemblymember Curtin, do you want to have any follow-up on Mayor's oral report or the two questions that were raised?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr. Mayor. Now, there are many things you said in your oral report about what's going on in the last week, and particularly of note was your support for the organisation called Black Lives Matter. Now, I'm sure we agree with that as a phrase, and of course, most people would agree that all lives matter, whether they're black, white, brown, or any other colour. But Black Lives Matter is an anarchist and a Marxist organisation that wants to defund the police. Now, as you're in charge of the police in London, why are you supporting an organisation that wants to defund the police?
I think you're conflating organisations with movements and the cause. And I support fully the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't support individual organisations that you refer to. I'm quite clear. The police need more funds, not less. So I'm not in favour of defunding the police. I spent the last 4 years campaigning to get a decent funding from the government and to reverse their cuts. The evidence from the last 10 years is the only people defunding the police are the Conservative government.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you don't want to defund the police, but, you know, whether it's a movement or an organisation, the aims of this movement are to defund the police, and they have another set of aims as well that are very, very much on the far left Marxist side of politics. I mean, another one of their aims is they want to disrupt the natural nuclear family, which would cause chaos in society. I mean, that is part of the movement. Do you support that aim as well, Mr. Mayor?
Chair, the question is, do I want to inverted commas, disrupt the nuclear family? And the answer is probably no, isn't it?
Well, that's good. It's good to know that you actually, when you think about it, you don't actually agree with the aims of this movement, Black Lives Matter. And maybe, it's good to red pill you a little bit, Mr. Mayor. Another one of their aims is to smash capitalism. Do you think that's a good aim of Black Lives Matter as well?
I think the premise of these questions are based upon misunderstandings about what Black Lives Matter movement is about. And what I'd say respectfully to the Assembly members, just to look into what Black Lives Matter movement is about and the history of the Black Lives Matter movement, which began before George Floyd's brutal killing that was videoed and seen across the world. It's the racism, the discrimination and the inequality that black people face, not just in Minnesota, Minneapolis and the USA, but around the world as well. But also the fact that our city has benefited hugely from slavery and the legacy of slavery. Indeed, both you and I were paying up in our taxes reparations to slave owners who freed slaves 200 years ago. And what Black Lives Matter, the movement, is about is recognising that still in 2020 there is racism, inequality and discrimination. And I know that others who are clearly trying to find ulterior motives for Black Lives Matter to denigrate the organisation should reflect why it is they feel so strongly of being resistance to fighting racism, inequality and discrimination.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I have looked at Black Lives Matter. I have looked into it, which is why I'm asking you these questions. And you can look on the website of Black Lives Matter, and their aims are just there and they're stated. It doesn't seem that you actually knew that that's what their real aims are. Now, of course, we all are horrified at slavery that took place 200 to 500 years ago in this country, but slavery still goes on. And there are 27 million slaves around the world. I know you like to make comments about what's going on around the world, but one of the countries where there is still slavery going on is Libya. And there are black slaves there, and many of the Arab people living in Libya actually put black people into slavery. Do you have anything to say about that? Because that is where we should be focused today, on stopping modern slavery rather than worrying about statues and things that happened 200 years ago.
Well, as mayor, I've committed more to the issue of addressing the issue of modern slavery than any mayor in the history of our city. But I'll tell you this, our ability to fight slavery in Libya or elsewhere is made much harder by the government abolishing the Department for International Trade, one of the greatest legacies of the Labour government, established in 1997. And if you feel so strongly about slavery in Libya, you should be campaigning with Labour against the government's plans to merge DFID into the FCO, so it's subsumed and the work they do is diluted.
Well, that's a completely other point, but I mean that actually that is what has actually happened there is a good thing, because the Department for International Development really just wastes a lot of British taxpayers' money on often green projects and so on, sticking up wind farms in areas where they don't provide much electricity. But that's a whole other matter. But in this country, there is one issue of slavery that I do need to point out, and that is the case of raping and grooming gangs which have gone on in this country in Rotherham, Rochdale, Derby, Oxford, Bristol, and in London as well. And this is done, as we know, by the Quilliam Foundation report, by majority ethnic Pakistani heritage people. And they put people into slavery in this country, sex slavery. Do you think that is an area that we need to focus on when we are dealing with modern slavery?
I think some of the prosecutions brought by the chief prosecutor, as it was then, Nazir Afzal, who, according to my basic knowledge about Islam and Pakistan, I think is of Pakistani origin and Islamic faith. Good example of a chief prosecutor using his values to good stead in relation to bringing prosecutions against the groomers and stuff. And I'm really proud of any prosecutions being brought where people who are guilty of these heinous crimes are brought to book. I think it's really important for the full force of the laws to be brought against anybody committing these sorts of heinous criminal offences, as is indeed all serious criminal offences, particularly against women and girls.
These have obviously been found in many, many other cities and towns around the country, but there hasn't been much of many prosecutions happened in London. But, obviously as the police commissioner for Northumberland said this is happening anywhere, and the only reason why it's not being found is that people aren't looking. Are you looking in London for grooming gangs in London in order to prosecute people? Because if it's going on in cities like Oxford and Bristol and Peterborough and Aylesbury, smaller places, it's surely going on in London as well on a large scale.
Can I just be clear, Chair? Is the inference that because of my faith or my ethnic origin, I'm not seeking to follow these crimes?
No, I'm asking you because you're the Police and Crime Commissioner.
Assembly Member Curtin, I think you're pretty much drifting now onto drifting off the subject itself. So can I just ask you to stick to the topic and ask a relevant question, please?
Well, Chair, I mean, I was originally asking about Black Lives Matter, and then the Mayor started talking about slavery, and the questioning has developed.
Yeah, but you're still going off the tangent now, so can you please be cautious about that and not ask...
Okay, well, Chair, if you want to disallow my question, that's your prerogative.
Well, I will use that then. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on now to the questions to the Mayor on the priority order. The first question is number 1754, Mr. Mayor, and that's entitled TfL Financial Operations in the name of Assembly Member Bailey. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. I'm in constant contact with TfL about the operation of the transport network in London and the organisation's financial outlook. COVID-19 has presented enormous challenges for TfL. 80% of TfL's operating budget comes from fares and other commercial activity. Given that only 5% of normal travel happened on the tube for much of March, April and May, it's no surprise that fares income collapsed by 90%. Londoners have done the right thing. They've stayed away from public transport, but this has hit TfL's finances extremely hard. At last month's TfL board meeting, an emergency budget was presented which assumes cost reductions and deferrals of nearly £1 billion and the use of £1 billion of TfL's cash reserves. Even with these measures, there was a funding gap of up to £1.9 billion in the first half of the year, which has been met through the deal with government. At next month's board meeting, a revised budget for 2020-2021 will be considered. I have regular discussions with the management at TfL, the most recent being on Tuesday, and my Deputy Mayor for Transport is heavily involved in the day-to-day running of the organisation and its finances. I chair the TfL board and I make sure that all decisions taken by the organisation are done in a transparent way with the best of interests in London and Londoners at heart. TfL has a key role to play in delivering the recovery, but the deal we've done with government is just a sticking plaster. We must now agree a sustainable way of funding TfL over the medium to long term. It is an indisputable fact that TfL has, under my leadership, tightened its belt and tackled the profligacy of the previous administration. It reduced its net operating deficit by 71% and increased its cash balances by 60% since May 2016. We've also, for the last 4 years, done something never achieved before, reduced the operating costs year on year at TfL. We've streamlined the organisation and made it more efficient. The reality is that the funding model for TfL is broken. Even before the pandemic, TfL had to manage the impact of an average reduction of around £700 million per year in government grant and was one of the only transport authorities in the world not to receive a direct government operational grant for day-to-day running costs. I'll be doing all I can to find a sustainable long-term answer. I just hope the government will do the same too.
Right. Thank you. Do you have a follow-up? Assembly Member Bailey, are you still with us?
Yes, I am. I think we've had a little
Would
with
you
the
like
internet. Fine. Can you hear me now, Chair?
Yeah, we can.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for your answer. Do you accept that as a major consequence of your financial mismanagement of Transport for London over the last 4 years, TfL was in an appalling position to cope with lockdown?
No, so the last 4 years we've managed to reduce operating deficit by more than 71%. So it went from £1.5 billion to £200 million. we managed to increase the gas cash balances by more than 16%, which meant before the pandemic our cash balances were more than £2 billion. We managed to year on year reduce operating deficits, never done before in the 6 years before I became mayor and TfL being formed. We reduced, for example, the numbers of non-permanent labour by more than 57% over the last 4 years, and we're also servicing the debt of more than £7 billion taken out by the previous mayor. We're in a good state and we have plans to go into surplus over the course of the next year and a half, but COVID will impact TfL's budget by around £4 billion a year. Every transport authority in the country has been affected by COVID, and every business in London has been affected by COVID as well.
Even if you don't want to admit your culpability, your recent statements give us a clue that you recognise some of your mistakes. Do you recall just over 3 months ago, on the 13th of March, you admitted that if re-elected, you would raise tube fares?
I think what I said was I would freeze the bus fares I've done over the last 4 years, which means in 2024, Londoners will still be paying £1.50. I said I'd extend the hopper fare, which has benefited hundreds of millions of journeys across our city, and any other fares would go up no more than the cost of living. You'll be aware that the previous mayor raised fares by more than 42%, and had I not been successful in 2016, my Conservative opponent was hoping to raise fares by more than 17%. Quite clear, Labour mayors freeze fares, Tory mayors raise them.
So you are going to raise fares, you admit to that?
So let me repeat, Chair, because I think the may have had a bad communication with this technology. So the bus fares that I've frozen over the last 4 years, they're still £1.50 from 2016, would carry on being frozen over the next 4 years. They'd still be £1.50 in 2024. The hopper fare would be continued going forward, so people could change fares many times they like within the course of an hour. And other fares would go up no more than the cost of living. It was still possible for me to freeze those fares, but they'd go up no more than the cost of living. That was a ceiling, not a floor. What the government has done with the conditions attached to the funding deal is not have a ceiling, but say they must go up at least by RPI plus 1. So it's not a maximum of cost of living, it's a cost of living plus 1%. Clear difference, and just demonstrates what we know, that dogs bark, ducks quack, Tories raise fares.
So why then on the 15th of May, after signing the bailout agreement, and I'm quoting here, you said they want fares to go up next January, ending 4 years of fare freeze that I delivered after last election. Had you forgotten your statement of 2 months earlier that you were going to... had you forgotten your statement from 2 months earlier that you were going to raise fares, or are you trying to take Londoners for fools and shift the blame?
Chair, one of the problems when you've already written your questions out is when I answer the question, you still read the question written out. As I've answered, bus fares would have been frozen for the next 4 years. So a bus fare in January 2016 was £1.50. It would have been £1.50 in January 2024 as well. So I would have frozen bus fares. Those bus fares are now going to go up because of the conditions attached to the funding deal from the government. So they will no longer be £1.50. It's quite straightforward, Chair.
No, it isn't, Mr. Mayor. I asked you about tube fares. You tried to intimate that the government had forced you to raise tube fares when you had announced long before lockdown that you were going to raise tube fares. So I put it to you, are you taking Londoners for fools by saying that it's the government forcing you to raise tube fares when you already said you were going to do that? It was in a TfL business plan and it's in several major media outlets across London. So are you taking Londoners for fools?
Well, Chair, let me just remind this everyone of the history. So the business plan in 2016 that I inherited also had fares going up above RPI. I ignored the business plan and froze the fares. I was quite clear in relation to what my intentions were. My intentions, which I telegraphed, were we're going to freeze bus fares. That's taken instead. The hopper fare stays. And as far as tube fares are concerned, they could well be frozen, but they'll go up no more than the cost of living. The conditions attached from the government mean that I can't do that. The conditions from the government are they must go up at least by RPI plus 1, as well as bus fares, tram fares and overground.
Mr. Mayor, in 2016, you used the words, no Londoner will pay more to travel in 2020 than they do in 2016. That was false then. It continues to be false now. This is a decision that you made to rise the fares. It predates.
Where's the question? You're reading the script. Come on, ask the question and listen to the answer.
So why are you now trying to make it look like the government asked you to raise these fares when you had already...
I published the conditions, Chair. I know that the government were not keen for me to publish the conditions. I published the conditions so Londoners can see in black and white what the conditions were. And Londoners won't be taken for fools. It's really important for Londoners to see who's responsible, not least for congestion charge rising, for fares going up, for under 18 paying fares, but also for conditions of those over 60 as well.
Mr. Mayor, so you are saying that your management of TfL had put TfL in a strong place when we have TfL has a record amount of debt. Crossrail needed a £3.35 billion bailout. 22 of 26 major projects have been paused or cancelled, and you don't believe that your poor management... Let's deal
with each of those things that he's reading out. In relation to debt, the previous mayor borrowed more than £7 billion. I've not borrowed more than £7 billion. I've been paying back the debt of the previous mayor, and in fact, the £2 billion we borrowed is to invest in infrastructure. In relation to operating costs, I'm the first mayor to reduce operating costs of TfL in the 16 years before I became mayor, including the previous 8 where Boris Johnson was the mayor. Operating costs went up year on year. Good example of waste, which I managed to reduce as mayor. When the previous mayor gave me the reins of TfL, our deficit was £1.5 billion. It didn't increase, it went down year on year, so it's £200 million, a reduction of more than 71%. Cash balances we've managed to increase as well, so we had more than £2 billion worth of cash balances. In fact, we spent £1 billion of our cash balances paying for Transport for London when we had no passengers using Transport for London. That's the very opposite of inefficiency. That's the very opposite of financial mismanagement. I'm sorry it doesn't go with the script he's written or been written for him. That's the reality.
Chair, the Mayor is deliberately filibustering and wasting our time. Let's be clear, Mr. Mayor. The 30% of TfL staff you laid off don't think that you have done something efficient.
Let's deal with the staff. We managed to reduce non-permanent staff by more than 57%. That's a massive saving to TfL. I'm sorry if he's in favour of us taking on more non-permanent staff. I'm not. I'd rather have permanent staff who are committed to TfL, who are cheaper and more professional in the long term.
Chair, can you stop the Mayor, please? He's deliberately wasting our time. He refused to answer the questions. We all know that he's run TfL into the floor and he should take responsibility for that. Thank you very much, Chair.
Right, okay. Assembly Member Dr. Moore, did you want to come back on this one?
I do, thank you, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mayor. We heard from the Deputy Mayor, Heidi Alexander, at the Transport Committee this week, and Mr. Bailey, Assembly Member Bailey was there, that due to current funding arrangements, with the removal of the operating subsidy under Boris Johnson's mayoralty, TfL is dependent on fares and other income to cover 80% of its costs. So she said, if passengers don't come back, the funding model is broken. And Londoners suffer at the hands of this political game playing. How important is it for the government to restore the operating subsidy to TfL? Thank you.
It's really important, and if members need to understand what's going on, and I'm really glad for what you just reminded us of, which is the deal made between the then mayor and the then chancellor in 2015 is one where the operating grant goes. And we've lost 42% of our operating grant from 2010, on average £700 to £200 million a year. And frankly speaking, for the foreseeable future, there will be the fares income coming in to pay for services, which is why the government needs to do one of a number of things, either restore the operating grant to pay for TfL, or to devolve more powers to London in relation to recommendations of the London Finance Commission so we can pay for some of the services ourselves. Around the world, governments are supporting their transport bodies, including around the country. For reasons the government need to answer, they don't want to support London. It's really important Londoners aren't caught in the crossfire between a party political government and TfL.
Thank you very much for that clear answer, Mr. Mayor. That will be all I want to ask, Chair.
Thank you. We'll now move on to the next question, which is in the name of Dr. Sahota. Question number 2067, testing times. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. This is a critical moment for our country as we enter the next phase of lifting the lockdown in response to COVID-19. I've been clear that we must have a robust test, trace, isolate and support system in place before easing lockdown restrictions further. I'm extremely concerned that 1/3 of people who tested positive nationally could not be reached by the contacts tracing system or refused to provide information about their contacts. The system must be straightforward so every Londoner with symptoms can easily take a test and have their contacts quickly traced if they test positive. There should be no barriers or obstacles. It's vital that Londoners have confidence in the test, trace, isolate and support system so they participate fully. Sage advised that the government objectives of the system should be to isolate as many contacts as possible, as quickly as possible, within 48 hours of symptoms starting. I'm seeking assurances the test, trace, isolate and support system is fully operational before easing lockdown measures further, including meeting turnaround times, reaching all contacts and gaining public confidence. I've written to the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care raising my concerns. I've previously met with Sir John Newton and Professor Whitty to ensure the specific needs of London are considered as part of the government's national system. I have weekly meetings with my statutory health advisor and regional director for PHE London, Professor Fenton. I'm also calling on the government to report key performance indicators to demonstrate the functioning of test, trace, isolate and support system in London. Everyone who's been in contact with someone who has tested positive must isolate for 14 days. Only now is the government asking boroughs to put systems in place to manage local outbreaks. London boroughs have already provided support for shielded and high-risk groups, and this needs to continue. It's vital local government has the necessary powers and funding to deliver this crucial work. We cannot afford a second wave of this virus, which already has killed thousands, damaged our economy, and created social implications that will take years to fix.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that answer. And of course, as we are coming out of this lockdown, we also heard yesterday from the Evening Standard that the United Kingdom was the second worst country for preparation in the world of rich countries. And of course, we know that the virus still exists there, and we've seen upsurges of this in Beijing and also in New Zealand. So we need to be very, very mindful, okay, that we have a proper system in place. And can you reassure Londoners that should there be a second spike, and there could very well be, in the absence of an adequate testing and tracing system, that if we have that happening, that we have the measures in place to address that issue?
This is a really important question. I'm concerned. I don't want to pretend otherwise. I'm concerned because we've had example after example of promises being made by the government that have been broken, from PPE equipment to testing capability, to test, trace, isolate support, to the app, and I could go on. The good news is it appears the numbers of people tested positive is going down, and the good news is the number of deaths are going down, and because of the Herculean efforts of those in the NHS, the capacity of the NHS is good at the moment. But you'll be aware there are a number of other essential treatments that have been delayed because of your focus and people in your profession on COVID-19. You're also aware that TTI is not fully operational, and you'd also be aware that yesterday the government minister said that the app may not be ready until winter. And so I'm worried about a second wave and the impact on not just further deaths, but our economy as well. And so we've got to be vigilant. I spoke to the Public Health England on this yesterday, and we're making sure we do what we can to make sure we don't have a second wave in our city, which would be just devastating for families who have already suffered hugely in the first wave.
And the other worrying thing, of course, Mr. Mayor, is that the COVID-19 has shown the inequalities in society, and also that the BMA community has been worst affected by this, disproportionately affected by this. And you know that we had to take out a very painful tooth ride to extract from the government the findings of the COVID report, which they hid right for weeks right before they admitted to it. But now that we do know that there are racially discriminated basis of the disproportionality, I'm also concerned, right, what measures are we taking to protect our BME communities, who will be at the face of any spike or resurge you get Do we have enough PPE in? Are we taking special measures to protect the BME community who already have been shown to be at increased risk?
Yeah, it's a really important issue in relation to risk assessments for vulnerable staff. That includes Black, Asian, minority ethnic staff, that includes those with underlying health conditions and older people as well. You'll be aware that in fact people of Bengali origin are 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than some other ethnic groups. Big source of concern, bearing in mind we've got lots of Londoners of Bangladeshi origin. It's really important that employers, as lockdown is eased, follow the advice from the government in relation to risk assessments. I'm really pleased the government's given more support to the health and safety executive team. Really important they have that support. If any employer wants advice, please, it's really important they get advice from not just Public Health England, but from the HSE. It's really important no Londoner risk their own personal health by going back to work too soon. One of the things that we've been lobbying for is to make sure, for example, there's equitable for those in no-pay jobs and 0 hours contracts. They don't inadvertently return to work or carry on working because they're worried they can't put food on the table if they take time off or self-isolate.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that.
All right. The next question on the order papers is from Assembly Member Barry, and that's on road pricing in London. Question number 1639, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. My transport strategy states that Transport for London will keep existing and planned road user charging schemes under review, including the congestion charge, low emission zone and ultra low emission zone. And that's what we're doing. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, TfL has reviewed the congestion charge, LEZ and ULEZ. On the 20th of March, TfL decided to suspend the operation of all 3 road user charging schemes with effect from the 23rd of March. This decision was made to facilitate the movement of London's critical workers and freight vehicles. After 7 weeks of suspension, the congestion charge, LEZ and ULEZ were reinstated on the 18th of May as a result of an immediate condition imposed by the government as part of their funding deal. My wider approach to paying for road use is set out in my transport strategy, and TfL continues to investigate whether there are ways to better reflect distance driven, emissions, time and road danger in a smart and fair system. New technologies could offer the potential for more sophisticated models of paying for road use in the longer term, but any future proposals would need to be preceded by detailed feasibility work and subject to consultation. The crisis has shown clearly that we need to have a flexible system. I've made changes to the fee charge in response to the changing circumstances, suspended it during the height of lockdown to support critical workers and reinstated it as a demand by the government. We have now made temporary changes to avoid gridlock and support the extra road space needed for walking, cycling and using public transport while maintaining social distancing. And these changes will be kept under review. Beyond these changes, my priority for TfL at this point is to continue to deliver the expansion of the ULEZ. Londoners deserve clean air at all times, not just temporarily during lockdown. And I'm not prepared to replace one public health crisis with another arising from a car-paced recovery.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There have always been good reasons of fairness for why we should get more revenue from drivers and less from fare payers. The congestion charge itself is now old enough to drive and has long needed to be replaced by something smarter. And the crisis situation now means that we have no choice but to make TfL's revenue more diverse and more resilient. So it's now well past time to turn that long-term investigation, that long-term promise to look at road pricing at some point into action now. And I would remind you that way back in January 2017, Assemblymember Pigeon and my Green colleague, Assemblymember Caroline Russell, put forward a budget amendment proposing a study of options for road charging. And last year, Centre for London's report, Green Light, which is very, very good, already did a lot of the technical heavy lifting. I think it's you've got to admit, Mr. Mayor, it's well overdue for you to start having that honest, open conversation with Londoners about this. They will have questions about smart road pricing, about fairness, about privacy, and about the benefits. So isn't it now the right time to be finally having that debate and start involving citizens in discussing this?
Chair, the member referred to honesty and admissions. I hope she would be honest and admit that a number of people predicted that we wouldn't be able to get the ultra emission zone, the world's first, off the ground in April 2019, and we did. without any hiccups. The world's first ultra-emission zone that has led to huge improvements in quality of air in London, nitrogen oxide down, carbon emissions down. At the same time, we're now trying to make sure we can roll out the ultra-emission zone to all of London for freight coaches and buses in 2020, and for up to the North Circular and South Circular by October 2021. It's not a done deal. We'll be able to do that.
Sorry,
and our focus.
completely off the topic of smart road charging here.
Well,
and you're listing things you have done, not what you're going to do.
No, we haven't. But that's the point. We haven't rolled out the ultra-low emission zone to the rest of London, which is a massive feat. There's a huge amount of technological work that's still got to be done in relation to this. And there's no guarantee it will be as successful as the sea charge area was. So our focus is making sure we get that
really
right.
Sorry. I don't have as much time as usual in this session, and it's clear you haven't answered my question about road pricing and having this debate with Londoners. I'm really sorry that you don't have a plan, but I'm going to have to cut this short now. I'm really sorry. Thank you very much, and we'll come back to this another time.
Right, moving on to the next question, which is from Assembly Member Curtin. You only got about 30 seconds left. You still want to pursue your question on TfL's on road plans, please? Assembly Member Curtin.
No, thank you, Chair. I'll withdraw the question.
Right. Okay. We move on to the next question, Mr. Mayor, and that is in the name of Assembly Member O'Connell, and that is on TfL's capital programme, question number 1785. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The primary focus in TfL's emergency budget, which is also necessitated because of the COVID crisis, is to minimise expenditure while we assess priorities for the longer term. Following the safe stop at construction sites in late March, TfL is now restarting some projects. The focus is on schemes that are substantially complete or contractually committed. TfL have also prioritised projects that are safety or operationally critical, that support social distancing, save money, or are third-party funded. Opportunities to restart work on projects meeting these criteria continue to be reviewed across TfL's capital delivery programme. Work is now resumed, for example, on the Bank Station capacity upgrade, the Northern Line extension, and the transformation of Old Street roundabout. There are safeguards in place with shifts staggered and new social distancing markers and runway systems installed, and workers returning to sites in phases. Design and other prep work on many projects have continued during the safe stop, with staff and many of TfL's contractors working from home. However, TfL has seen an overall income loss of around 90% due to the pandemic. To ensure vital capital investment projects such as the Sutton Link in your own constituency are achievable, it's essential that an agreement with government is reached for long-term, steady and sustained funding. Even before the pandemic, TfL has had to manage the impact of an average cut of around £700 million per year in government grant, and was one of the only transport authorities in the world not to receive a direct operational grant for day-to-day running costs from the government. Since the removal of the government grant, there has been no certainty of long-term funding, which has made planning extremely challenging. However, improvements through the capital programme are still being made against that backdrop. Like the rest of the UK, local authorities within London have generally been excluded from government funding schemes. For example, 99.6% of London's roads network has received no sustained central government funding for maintenance, with just those managed by Highways England receiving funding, and all the vehicle excise duty Londoners pay is spent outside London by the government.
Right.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that answer. I fully understand, particularly the exchange with Assembly Member Bailey about the financial issues that TfL and yourself face at the moment. I come at this from a constituency point of view, unashamedly, and of course your problem, Mr. Mayor, is that you will be judged over your full term. So my questions here are based around Croydon and Sutton, and what you will have done for those boroughs over your term, and they will judge you on the whole term. So my first question really is, there are two schemes particularly in those boroughs that are very important. One is the 5 ways interchange, which was visited by Transport Committee, and also, of course, and I make no apologies for returning to it, the Sutton tram. Mr. Mayor, are you saying therefore that those schemes are completely binned now under your mayoralty?
Well, you'll be aware, Chair, it's really important that I'm candid about Sutton Links. Sutton Links always had an issue in relation to the funding gap, even before the pandemic. You'll be aware that I continue to commit £79 million to this. Merton Council are committing, I think, 10 million, and Sutton 26 million. The project's going to cost between 400 and 600 million. So there's already a big funding gap of circa 250 to 350 million pounds. Unless that gap could be met before the pandemic, the Sutton to Croydon tram could proceed, and we were talking to the councils about how they could meet that funding gap. Clearly, unless the councils come up with a way of meeting that funding gap, or a third party or the government is an issue, our commitment is still there, was still there before the pandemic. In relation to all schemes, you mentioned 5 ways, and we'll be having another budget in July for TfL, Senator O'Connell, and we'll see what we can do in the July budget. And you'll be aware in the negotiations with the government, which we need to have for the second half of the budget, we'll be explaining to them some of the reasons why some of these projects are so important. Some of these projects, you'll be aware, will lead to recovery being swifter than it otherwise would be, but also they lead to jobs being created, because construction generally does lead to jobs being created.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that. My question really around that is, and I do understand the issues here, is about the fact that we talked about shovel-ready projects, and I fear again the Outer London and the Croydon and Suttons will not be part of that. I will ask you a further question. I think you're looking at street space funding for the boroughs, and I know that my borough, Croydon particularly, has bid for 1.7 million, and I hope that is successful. And my last question, my second to last question is, you mentioned the 70 million commitment. Are you saying that the 250 million growth pot is still in play for the coming year?
That's one of the things we'll be discussing with the government going forward in the negotiations that take place and got to be resolved before mid-October. I certainly hope they are, because obviously, as the name says, it's for growth, and the government wants growth, and growth in London benefits the rest of the country as well. Okay,
well, I mean, my concluding comments and question, Mr. Mayor, is that, as I say, next spring you'll be campaigning in the Croydons and Suttons of London, and it will be interesting what you'll say to those residents in those boroughs that after 5 years, what capital project will you deliver to those boroughs? Because at the moment, they will feel shortchanged. So I do hope you can try to pick that up in your last year, Mr. Mayor.
Chair, can I just say I'm really looking forward to revisiting Croydon and Sutton to talk about the fantastic new affordable housing schemes we've begun, the new council homes we've begun there, the extra police we've invested in Croydon and Sutton, the regeneration that we're helping in relation to Croydon Town Centre, but also the arts. Fairfield Hall is amazing. Great council in Croydon doing great work, and I'm looking forward to going there again and again and again between now and May to ask them to lend me their vote again for a further 4 years of a Labour Mayor doing a great job for Croydon and Sutton.
You will be asked at that time, and I take some of those points, you will be asked at that time what capital projects you have delivered, how you have improved the transport across those great boroughs, and I sense, as I say, I will repeat, that residents will feel shortchanged and judge accordingly. Thank you.
Okay, the next question is from Assembly Member Arnold, and it is on under 18's travel concession, question number 1874. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. If government ministers continue to insist on the removal of free travel from children and young people in London, families and young people across the city will feel the impact. Life will be made harder for low-income Londoners, and extra uncertainty and worry will be forced on millions of people. There are nearly 2 million children and young people under the age of 18 in London. Nearly 60% are Black, Asian, or from other ethnic minority communities. We should not be removing free travel from them. I've repeatedly made my views clear to government. I've asked them to drop this condition from the TfL funding deal and to work with us on finding other ways to encourage more children to work and cycle to work. This condition was crowbarred into the TfL funding agreement at the 11th hour, along with a number of other deeply political conditions. Not only is this harsh and unfair, we said at the time, this was a massively complicated thing to do, and we have been proved right. Any system of working out who is eligible for free school travel and who isn't will be complicated and will involve inevitable delays. Staff in councils and schools who are busy trying to work out how to adjust classrooms and playgrounds to the new normal will be asked to get involved in assessing which children should get a free bus pass and which shouldn't. The children who most need to return to education will face the biggest barriers in accessing it. Any 17 and 18-year-olds who may have chosen colleges in different boroughs will potentially face paying multiple adult fares every day. I've told the government that if they're intent upon doing this, they need to set the rules themselves. I'm not going to do their dirty work for them. I'll continue to do what I can to ensure children and young people across London continue to benefit from free travel.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that complete response. As you say, this taking away this concession will disproportionately impact BAME families, low-income families, and huge areas of London. We will have parents having to take the car out again, which will undermine all the excellent work that's been done in terms of streets for school. Were these costs and inequalities realised by the government when they imposed this condition? And are you able to say whether an EQIA was carried out by the government?
No, Chair. In the 2 days before the deadline to have the deal agreed, and we were negotiating for 6 weeks, that's when the number 10 advisor crowbarred these conditions in, never mentioned before by the DFT or the Treasury, and clearly no quality impact assessment done, clearly no awareness, or if there was, it was ignored, of the impact it would have on poorer families. And you'll be aware from your knowledge as a Londoner, these families, a large number of them are black, Asian, minority ethnic. And the government can't, on the one hand, say they're serious about addressing disproportionality in society, and then introduce a fare that will have a disproportionate impact on black, Asian, minority ethnic.
So, Mr. Mayor, it would follow then, it seems to me, that if an EQIA is a requirement of to be undertaken by policy, this is government's own inquiry, and they haven't done that assessment, then surely does that mean you will have to do it and then feed that back to government? Because if you actually show what the mitigations are not to implement the cuts to the concessions.
I think you've articulated far better than I have the challenges. So there's the fact that it's harsh, it's unfair. It has a disproportionate impact on not just poor families. We know the poor families tend to be black, Asian, minority ethnic, but also more than 60% of under 16-year-olds are black, Asian, minority ethnic. But also, it's really hard to do. I mean, just think about where do you draw the line? Under 5s, under 11s, under 16s, those with special educational needs, those who live more than 2 miles away, those who go to faith schools, those in receipt of working tax credit, those in receipt of free school meals. It is a technical nightmare to do, which is why I've said to the government, look, if you're so insistent on doing it, you tell me how we're going to do this. And I know the Conservative group in the Assembly are notable in their silence about what is arguably the most important social justice issue for these families over the course of the next few days, weeks and months.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. I was party to arguing this with the first administration because we absolutely then needed to deal with this injustice. What I don't understand, and perhaps you can help me, is Boris Johnson, when he was the mayor, retained these concessions. So why is he now okaying the removal of them? Isn't this just plain politics? And does he understand the impact that this is going to have on BAME Londoners' education? The other day he was talking about the importance of education as the key passport for success in the future.
Well, it gets worse than that, because you will know in London, actually, many children don't go to the school that's in walking distance. They go to a school that they need to get to by using public transport often, because we discourage mum, dad, carer to drive them to school. Many choose colleges that aren't nearest to their home. That's how London works, very different from the rest of the country. So there's one or two conclusions we draw. Either the Prime Minister knows this has a disproportionate impact on black, Asian, minority ethnic children, and has still chosen to go ahead and do it, that speaks volumes. Or he doesn't really care about this, he's ignorant of this, hasn't looked into this, which in itself, it draws the number of conclusions and begs a number of questions. Either of those two scenarios, infer me to believe that this Prime Minister doesn't really care about a return to education, but also doesn't really care about addressing the issue of inequality that still exists in our city in 2020.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Right. Can we move on to question from Assembly Member Pigeon? Travelling safety in London during the COVID-19 pandemic. Question number 1614.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. Since the start of the lockdown, we've launched a massive communications campaign to reduce demand for public transport. This is including posters on the TfL estate and using adverts on radio and in the press. TfL has now sent 60 million emails to passengers telling them not to travel unless it's essential and providing other travel advice. We're providing advice to all sectors, businesses, retailers and schools, and we're planning another campaign aimed at the hospitality sector. So far, TfL has contacted thousands of private companies and via them boroughs around 3,000 schools. We led by example on our construction sites, bringing them to a safe stop in March, with work sites now beginning a phased restart. We're putting in place staggered shifts and break times to spread journeys outside peak times. The effective transport capacity is severely constrained if people are to be able to socially distance. Our street space plan is helping to protect public transport capacity by giving more people the option to walk and cycle safely, whole journey or parts of journey. We've already delivered more than 15,000 square metres of new space for walking and cycling. Santander cycles have seen incredible demand, and the scheme has broken several records in recent weeks, with over 1.1 million hires in May. And I'm pleased that the free hire scheme for NHS staff, carers and police staff has been well used, accounting for more than 30,000 journeys. To keep up with the high demand, 14 new docking stations will be created and more than 1,700 new bikes will be made available. You'll be aware that government's required us to restrict free travel for older people before 9 a.m, which will encourage those people to travel outside peak times where possible. And there's lots of changes to how the bus and tube networks operate. We've deployed BTP and stewards at the busiest interchanges to encourage social distancing and activate queuing systems if it's required. And recently we've put in place limits to the number of customers on board buses at any one time.
Thank you very much indeed for your answer, Mr. Mayor. If we're to ensure social distancing is maintained while more people are starting to travel again, I think we really must look at all transport capacity, make sure it's all used and be imaginative. So I've got a few suggestions for you this morning. Pre-COVID, Stratford station was incredibly crowded, yet there is significant spare capacity at the nearby Stratford International Station. And that station could help relieve the situation, offer significant relief to Stratford Regional Station, and it is only 6 minutes from central London. Yet the current fare pricing deters many people from using this station. So I'm wondering what discussions you're having with South Eastern and also the Department for Transport to change this and to allow more passengers to use this route.
Chair, can I first put on record, the Assembly member has been really constructive over the last 14 weeks, helping the Deputy Mayor and TfL with advice like this. Can I be honest, I've not got the answer. Can I take this away and I promise to write to her, or Heidi will, because, I'm not sure the answer. I don't want to mislead inadvertently the Assembly member, so I'll write back to you.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's an issue here around the pricing.
No, I get the point. No, it's a sound point. Can I look into it?
I think it's a way we could add capacity. Another area where you could make a change very quickly, and you could do this, is by putting Thameslink on the tube map. Thameslink is fully accessible for disabled people. It's an incredibly frequent tube-like service through the centre of London, and it could provide an alternative route for many people, reducing pressure, particularly on things like the Northern Line. And this was a recommendation that came from the Transport Committee recently. So will you look to put Thameslink on the tube map?
On that one, Chair, the rail delivery group, which Heidi sits on, they meet on a weekly basis and sometimes more than once a week. What I can do is make sure that the Deputy Mayor puts this on the next agenda item with the RDG, because that will be the place to coordinate this happening.
I think lots of Londoners don't know about it. It's this hidden gem of virtually a tube line, as I say, through the centre of London, and it's fully accessible. So people with mobility issues really welcome being able to travel like anyone else. And I think there's also space on those Thameslink lines. So I hope you can take that forward, but you could make that decision and put that line on the map. Will you do that?
We'll discuss it at the RDG. I'm not sure it's quite as straightforward as that. We'll speak to the DfT on the RDG to see if we can take this forward.
Thank you very much. And finally, last month, I raised the issue of flexible fares, and especially early bird fares. I think they could make a real difference in spreading demand, especially in that early morning peak. Last month, when I asked you about this, you specifically said that this was a change we are exploring. So I'm wondering, what progress have you made on that?
Well, thanks for the question. We were exploring this. You'll be aware that we're still in negotiations with the DfT about the next phase of the deal we make with the government. You'll be aware that they've tied our hands with fares on a number of issues. The current Conservative candidate for the mayoral contest, we had an exchange about fares earlier on during MQTs. The DfT are seeking to tie our hands on number 10. And so this is one of the things we'll be discussing with them. You'll be aware there currently is off-peak fares, but it doesn't include what you're referring to, which is pre-rush hour. Yeah. And you'll be well aware, because you've raised this before, it's the cleaners and the poorer Londoners who tend to do the pre-rush hour stuff before 5:45. And so again, one of the things we'll be discussing with the DfT when it comes to fares going forward will be one of these with this issue.
I think with September coming up, where I think that will see a shift of a lot more people going back to work, having that in place could really help spread the rush hour. So thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much.
Right, Mr. Mayor, the next question is from Assembly Member Hall, and that's question number 1795, which is about TfL emergency budget.
Thank you, Chair. I'm in constant contact with TfL about their performance and TfL's financial condition. I have regular discussions with TfL's leadership, and my Deputy Mayor is hands-on in the day-to-day management of the organisation. The effect of this pandemic has been huge and widespread across the country, and London has been no exception. It presents unprecedented challenges for TfL. 80% of TfL's operating budget comes from fares and other footfall-driven income. The considerable decline in travel has seen TfL's income collapse. As you know, I chair the TfL board. At the last meeting on the 2nd of June, we approved the emergency budget for this financial year, an interim review of TfL's forecast financial position. We'll be looking next month at a revised budget for 2021. This will also be considered alongside its year-to-date performance update. The TfL will continue to share detailed internal management reports periodically with me and my Deputy Mayor, as it has always done. Performance reporting will also go to the DfT. TfL will also continue to report through the board and its committees, with reports and minutes being made publicly available. Since I've been Mayor, TfL has had an excellent track record in terms of financial management. Were it not for COVID-19, TfL was on track to reduce its net deficit, and we'd already reduced them by 71% since I became Mayor. And its cash balances at the end of the last financial year were 16% higher than they were 4 years previously. We've done a lot to tackle waste and ensure TfL is operating as efficiently as possible. TfL has a key role to play in delivering London's recovery. I have every confidence that they'll rise to the many challenges that have arisen from coronavirus, and I'll be there to make sure that's the case.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can you tell me, you use the word constant contact, etc. Can you tell me just how often you find out or you look into the finances of TfL?
I mean, once a week with the CFO. I get daily emails from the Commissioner. I speak to my Deputy Mayor 4 or 5 times a week, I think, and she speaks to the Commissioner and the CFO on an almost daily basis.
Okay, so you're right on top of that. Obviously, with Crossrail in the background, one worries about your financial contact at the moment with TfL. Is there anything that you could then send to the Budget Committee? Because clearly we're so far behind all the time. We want to make sure that we have constant access to the finances of TfL.
I'm really keen to make sure that you've got what you need. So on Crossrail, which is a bit different. So Crossrail hope to have a better idea. They told us by the end of June in relation to the impact of COVID-19 on timelines and also on monies they will need. they've still got a very much can-do attitude. I'll make sure after this meeting I drop a note to Mark Wild and Tony Meggs to say you'd like any information. I'm sure you'd appreciate even in draft form some numbers from them. The July TfL board meeting should give us a better idea. I'll make sure as soon as Simon Killenback has got some numbers, he shares them with you as well.
That's very helpful, thank you. Can you tell me what the difference is between now, since COVID, to your interactions financially with them before? Is it the same? Is it more? How is it now?
It's more. So before COVID, I would meet face to face with the CFO once every 2 weeks. Since COVID, well, during COVID, there were times where it was daily. Now we've gone to once a week. And in between the once in the weeks, I'll speak often to other members of the management team, Andy Lord and Gareth Powell, more regularly. Simon Gillenback, on average now, it's once a week, but there were sometimes it was once a day, sometimes more than once a day.
Okay, that's good to hear. In the past, TfL have, whether it's fair or not, developed a reputation of being very wasteful, not just in terms of delays to projects and overruns, but also on things like nominee passes. So have you given any instructions to tighten up these passes or any other directions to look at how expenditure is examined?
So the phrase I used in the 2016 campaign was TfL is flabby, which goes to your point about inefficiencies and stuff. TfL are currently looking at all areas where they can save money, but also they can increase revenue streams. There's two parts of the equation. One is to bring in more money, two is to make savings where we can, and they'll continue to do that.
Okay, well, I'm very grateful for the information you're going to be sending to me, albeit in draft form. I don't mind, as long as we can keep some eye on this. We don't want the Crossrail type situation. Again, thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you. We now move on to a question from Assembly Member Moore, and it's on effect of the TfL funding agreement. Question number 2029, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. My focus in the short term is not on maximising revenue, though we're in a challenging financial position. My focus and TfL's focus is on keeping those who operate and use public transport services in the capital safe. It's very clear that the current fares income will not cover the cost of running services while so few people are able to use them. TfL is running very nearly a full service now, as sick or isolated staff have returned to work, but even at normal service levels, the tube will only be able to carry around 15% of the passengers it could before because of social distancing requirements. As a result of the government's decision in 2015 to withdraw TfL's operating grant, just over 80% of TfL's income has been generated through fares and commercial revenues, and fares income has reduced by about 90% during this crisis, as Londoners did the right thing and avoided travelling. This means the need to agree a new funding model has never been greater. This will have to involve long-term sustainable funding from government or giving London more control over key taxes we can pay for ourselves. TfL is currently one of the only transport authorities in the world with such low levels of external funding. The government insisted on TfL taking steps to maximise revenue in the funding agreement as agreed in May. Some steps are already underway to meet those objectives where it's sensible, such as reinstating front door boarding on buses to enable resumed fare collection.
Assembly Member Moore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to follow up on some of these safety aspects. On the 18th of May, you said under social distancing, tube capacity was 13 to 15%, but on 2nd of June, the Commissioner said the overall planning assumption was 15 to 20% capacity. What's led TfL to revise that capacity upwards?
I think we're in danger of confusing capacity with demand. So the capacity is between about 13 and 15% at 2 metres. If it goes down to 1 metre, it goes to 25%. But because TfL have been amazing, because the staff have been amazing, they're able to provide almost complete lines. For example, the Victoria line is running a train every 80 seconds. That means they're able to meet demand of between 15 and 20%.
The Prime Minister has said he wants to reduce the 2 metre social distancing requirement, which is obviously key to this, once there's progress made in getting the virus down. Would you be happy to reduce the distance to 1 metre in future? And if so, what needs to happen for you to support such a move?
Well, I've seen the stuff in the media about this reduction from 2 metres to 1 metre, and I've spoken to business leaders who are really keen to have the reduction sooner rather than later, for the simple reason that it could lead to more customers returning to shops, and other businesses that people are running. I'm going to recognise the economic imperative of having recovery sooner rather than later. My view is that the worst thing we could do for not simply more people catching the virus and dying, but also our economy is to have a second wave that would overwhelm the NHS and lead to people not returning to shops and businesses. And so the key thing is, where is the virus? How many people are catching it? What is the R number? What is the advice from SAGE and the experts? But what are the circumstances in a reduction? And so those are the sort of things that we'll put into the mix. I've today written to the Prime Minister asking him to make it mandatory to wear a face covering in shops and other places where you can't keep a social distance, just like he has now finally in relation to public transport. That would make it safer, in my view, but could lead to more confidence as well.
And finally, if I may, obviously the economic imperative is a key one, but unfortunately the London COVID Transport Task Force's terms of reference have remained unpublished, and they're going to be obviously a key player in this. However, can you confirm whether the task force would be able to reduce social distancing on London Transport's network to 1 metre without your agreement if you were still unsure about it and didn't feel the evidence was there?
No, thanks for that question. No, they can't. I mean, I'm quite clear. You know, the reddest of red lines is the safety of those who use public transport, and the Commissioner wouldn't allow it. The Commissioner's quite clear about his responsibility in making sure that he's in charge of safety of public transport in London that TfL controls, not some task force.
Thank you. I'm sure Londoners will be very happy to hear that, and that you've got their best interests at heart. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Next question, Mr. Mayor, is from Assembly Member Ashlomi, MP, and that is on community policing as lockdown measures ease. Question number 2016.
Thank you, Chair. I know from personal experience the negative impact that the widespread use of stop and search can have. Done badly, it can make it much harder to tackle crime by pitting communities against the police and by discouraging key witnesses from reporting crime. But since I've been there, we've been working with the police to end the very worst practices of stop and search. As part of this, we've rolled out body-worn video, which has been a game changer by giving both the police and communities more confidence in their interactions. What we found is that when it's done professionally, properly and with evidence, intelligence-led stop and search can be effective in taking drugs and weapons off our streets. But I agree that it's concerning that negative experiences of the use of stop and search in London within BAME community seems to have got worse during the coronavirus epidemic. I remain in close contact with community groups, and my deputy mayors and I regularly hear firsthand the serious concerns and strength of feeling around the issues impacting black communities and their interactions with the police. My view is that our police officers need to have confidence in the use of their powers as they tackle criminality and violence, but that any use of stop and search or use of force must be proportionate and accountable. The MPs agrees with me when I say more needs to be done to improve relations between the police and Londoners, particularly black communities, so that they feel protected and served. That's why I've commissioned my deputy mayors for police in the communities to work with the police and communities to draw up an action plan for improving confidence, transparency and accountability. We're working closely with the Met to ensure a zero-tolerance approach to racism and discrimination, and to ensure their workforce is truly representative of our city and of all the communities they exist to serve. And I want to thank Chair through you, Senator Shalomi, for her continued work in this area in the community, in the Assembly and in Parliament.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and it's good to see that there will be an action plan addressing this really important issue. I just wanted to ask in relation to the stop and search. Over the last 12 months, Westminster, Newham, Southwark, Tower Hamlets and Lambeth, in that order, were the boroughs with the highest stop and search. In the last 3 months during the lockdown, Lambeth had the highest number of stop and searches of any London borough, over 5,500 stop and searches. What are the police doing to work with young people? Because obviously we've seen a number of young people, they had been locked down, they had been at home over the last few months. And just to make sure that they have that good community relationship with our young people as we enter the summer months.
This is a really important issue. Can I just explain why it's so important? It's an important issue not just for the black community, But if one part of our community lacks confidence in the police, it means they're not going to come forward and report crime, they're not going to come forward and be witnesses, they're not going to want to join the police service. So all of us suffer from a lack of trust and confidence between the police and the black community. So the police are doing a number of things to address the very issue that you're so concerned about, as indeed I am. From work around the divert and engage programs which we fund to divert people away, the diversion directory they're working on to divert people away, but also working with organisations that work with young people. It has been a challenge because of the lockdown, and so they're having to use social media more so than before, WhatsApp and other groups as well. We've also got dedicated officers that work with young people to engage them at a critical time, the so-called teachable or reachable moment. But we're really keen to make sure young people black young people in particular, have a positive experience of the police, but also the police have a positive experience of young black people as well.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One of the things you mentioned after the protests was around plans being drawn up to look at the police, and in addition to stop and search, the use of tasers within the BME community. How are the plans that you've outlined address this? Because this is an issue growing with some communities in London.
You're absolutely right. Firstly, I understand the concerns. So it's basically all use of police powers, where there's a concern, where there's discretion, that it could be applied disproportionately, from stop and search to arrest, to use of taser, to use of reasonable force, these sorts of issues. And the key question is, who polices the police? What are the checks and balances? How can we have confidence, bearing in mind the police have powers that you and I don't have, that they use them in a fair way? How do we make sure that people's inherent prejudices, we all have prejudices, don't demonstrate themselves in the job they do, bearing in mind the powers the police have? And so we're doing a number of things above what we've already been doing to make sure we can have that proper scrutiny. So you'll be aware, because you've had a big role in relation to advocacy in the community monitoring groups, in relation to the work taking place across our city, to make sure there's the proper checks and balances. On top of that, we're doing some work to address the issue, the concerns around trust and confidence, around accountability, and around scrutiny. And that's part of the action plan that Debbie and Sophie, my deputy mayors, are working on this area. And look, we can't escape the fact that lots of black Londoners are concerned. We can't pretend they're not concerned, because they are concerned, and they're genuinely concerned. And they're being responsible and saying to us, we're concerned. Now, they told us they're concerned. We can't ignore them. We'll address their concerns. And that's why the work that Debbie and Sophie are doing is listening to their concerns, working with the police to address their concerns. And I'll tell you this, I've had interactions with many commissioners in the past. And just to reassure you, this commissioner and her team understand the sensitivities of the black community and want to address these concerns.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That's reassuring to hear. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Next, we have question number 1845, which is from Assembly Member Devenish. It's about congestion charge consultation.
Thank you, Chair. I want to make clear that the government required us to bring forward these proposals. As part of the funding deal to enable our transport network to keep running during this critical time, the government insisted that we not only reintroduce the congestion charge immediately, but that we urgently bring forward proposals to widen the scope and level of the charges.
Chair, I'm sorry, that's not my question. Mr. Khan's not answering my question. We've already heard his statement before. Can he answer the question, please?
Well, Chair, I don't tell the Assembly member how to ask his questions. He can't tell me how to answer them. We're also being forced to increase TfL fares and take away travel for under 18s. It's wrong the government's punishing Londoners for doing the right thing. The temporary changes received widespread media coverage. The exceptional circumstances surrounding these changes, as well as their temporary nature, meant that it wasn't possible to hold a lengthy formal consultation. However, I wanted to make sure that Londoners and all interested stakeholders had an opportunity to feed in and make their views heard. TfL has invited people to share their views by the 4th of June. This invitation was published on TfL's website and in the Metro newspaper on the 29th of May. I'm pleased that so many people took the time to respond. Alongside the 3,000 emails received by TfL, a further 1,000 messages were sent to City Hall. We've listened to what people had to say, and as a consequence, I asked TfL to modify the original proposed changes and add further mitigations to the package. Much like a formal consultation exercise, the proposals were refined following consideration of the views expressed by the public and stakeholders. For example, the residence discount will now be open to new applicants until 31st July, meaning that residents who've only ever driven on the weekend and so have never applied for the discount will have until the 31st of July to do so. We've also extended the NHS patient reimbursement rules so that people who are at most risk can receive a refund if they travel to their hospital appointments by car. In addition to NHS, ambulance and care worker reimbursements I previously announced, we're also working on reimbursement arrangements for local authorities and charities operating in the zone when they're providing services in response to COVID-19. TfL is working with partners to develop the details of these arrangements with the intention they'll be put in place as soon as possible. Reimbursements under this new scheme will be backdated to when the changes go live, which is next Monday, the 22nd of June.
Mr. Mayor, can you think of a single public consultation during the last 4 years, or indeed the last 20 years, the Greater London Authority, that has been less than a week?
Well, this wasn't a formal consultation, Chair, because of the conditions imposed by the government. The reason why the Assembly member was trying to cut me short when I was explaining the reason why we're doing this is because he's embarrassed at his government. What he should do is, rather than being embarrassed, he should lobby his government.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, my time is limited. I thought we had a cross-party consensus that we all understand that TfL do a pretty good job at running a very complex asset management system, but I thought we had an agreement they need to do more in terms of customer service and not having a tin ear. Did you instruct them to have such a short public consultation? Because it's a sham to have a few days for such a major change, whether you're for it or against it. All I'm asking is Londoners get their say.
Well, Chair, this is a really good example of mock anger from the Conservatives.
No, there's no mock.
But it's their,
let me answer the question,
but it's
please.
The member is seeking to heckle me because he's embarrassed at his government and he's trying to muddy the waters. It's his government that told us to immediately reinstate the congestion charge and to bring forward urgent proposals to widen the scope and level of charges. If he feels so strongly
Mr.
about
Mayor, can I get a word in,
why isn't he lobbying?
Mr. Mayor, can I get a word in? My time is limited, Mr. Mayor. You get to ask all the questions. I get to ask very few. My question, sir, is...
Can you allow Mayor to complete the answer, please?
I think I've heard his answer, Chair. He's given it to about 3 Assembly members. Can I ask about my church faith group?
He can't interrupt the answer because he doesn't like it.
There wasn't an answer, that's the problem. I'd like you to talk to me about how you've gone out to engage with church groups, with businesses suffering after coronavirus, and with pensioners and the disabled, because this is a sham consultation. This is a serious point, Mr.
Chair,
you can't just ram through public policy without listening to Londoners.
Chair, the problem with this mock anger is the evidence is the opposite of the mock anger. If this member was really angry and genuine, where's his lobbying of the grant shaps? Where's his lobbying of Boris Johnson? Where is his letters and his anger saying, how dare you?
Mayor, asking you to extend the congestion charge.
It doesn't work if I'm interrupted.
Look,
Mr. Mayor, I'll have one final question if I can.
No, I haven't answered your last 3.
Well, no, you haven't.
You can't have a
this kind of
approach to questions.
Can I please ask both of you to stop now?
It's ridiculous. He claims to want to speak for his residents, then doesn't wait for the answer. This is ridiculous.
Mr. Mayor, can I finish?
It's even worse than Assembly Member Bailey. He was really bad.
Mr. Mayor, could I finish on the point? This is a temporary measure.
No, I'll answer your last 3 questions, Chair.
Will you confirm?
Chair, can you rein him in, please? He's out of control.
Mr. Mayor, will you confirm?
Chair, is it my turn or his?
Measure, and will you give us a date when you
will let him finish because he started.
A full statutory public consultation and not just try and ram this through as a permanent measure?
Mr. Mayor, final word, please.
Chair, with respect, he's asked 4 questions. I've not been able to answer any of them because of his ranting. Let me just deal with this point. If he is serious about being concerned about the lack of a formal, lengthy consultation, his anger and concern should be addressed and directed towards the Conservative government who require TfL as
Chair,
part
Chair,
of
can I leave it there? I'm not getting
Look,
asked.
let me stop here.
No point. Mr. Mayor will not answer
Can I
the
please
question. He's
stop
wasting
both of you here?
group time. Can you
Look,
cut him off and I will
I'm going to
It's
stop
a
here.
farce.
Can we stop? Yeah. Look, this kind of talking over each other and heckling does not help anyone. Can I please urge the members, the mayors to stick to their question, succinct answers and move on? Because I didn't, frankly, and same with the listeners probably, didn't pick up quite a lot of this that has been happening. So for everyone, may I please have a plea that do not heckle, allow Mr. Mayor to answer the questions and stick to the point, please, as well from both sides. Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question. Yeah, okay. And that is from Assembly Member Dismore, which is on cladding remediation. Question number 1952. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. On Sunday, like many Londoners, I reflected on the 3 years that have passed since the tragedy at Grenfell Tower. I commend the Grenfell community for their campaigning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Here.
Sorry, can you please, members who are not asking questions, can you please make sure your microphones are on the mute? I could hear other voices coming through. Sorry about that, Mr. Mayor, please carry on.
I commend the Grenfell community for their campaigning. They seek justice and accountability for the loss of their family, friends and neighbours. They rightly ask for people to live in safe homes. They're understandably frustrated with the pace of change and fearful that a similar tragedy could happen again. Sadly, the government's track record on Grenfell is one of broken promises. After the tragedy, the then Prime Minister pledged to rehouse everyone in 3 weeks. 3 years on, 7 families are still living in temporary homes. Next, the government vowed to implement a major reform of social housing, but we're still waiting for the government's response to the social housing green paper published almost 2 years ago. And now, as you rightly highlight, the June 2020 deadline for the remediation of all buildings with unsafe ACM cladding has not been met. I was always clear that the previous Secretary of State was wrong to set this target. It was unfounded and irresponsible. Cladding remediation is complex and a single block can typically take 2 years in total to remediate. The recent COVID-19 pandemic is causing further delays in fixing unsafe cladding. Building owners are responsible for ensuring works carried out at pace, and my team is working daily with those that are applying for funding to hold them to account. It is simply unacceptable that these buildings are still unsafe 3 years on from Grenfell, but the truth is that government should have intervened much earlier. For many private buildings, cash flow is a barrier to remediation, and the 2 years it took government to announce the funding is the primary cause of delay. The June 2020 target was never going to be met. But the fact that it was set in the first place is evidence of a government that still 3 years on has not got to grips with the scale of the building safety crisis.
Well, thank you for that comprehensive answer, Mr. Mayor. And as you say, last Sunday marked the 3rd anniversary of the Grenfell Tower fire, in which 72 Londoners were killed. Yet despite one failed government deadline after another, as of last month, there were still 300 high-rise buildings with ACM yet to be remediated, including 197 blocks in London, let alone the 1,700 other high-rise buildings with different types of dangerous cladding, as estimated by MHCLG. In London, 52 buildings are outstanding in the social sector and 125 in the private sector, with ACM cladding still needing to be fixed, leaving thousands of people living in potentially dangerous homes. Yet Berkeley Homes Chief Executive Rob Perrins is reported today in the Times as having said that the government should relax the ban on ACM and its required removal. Berkeley still have apparently 20 tall buildings with ACM still needing to be fixed with Grenfell-type cladding, and it's forecast to have £500 million profits per annum for the next 5 years. Do you agree the best way to respect the memory of the victims of Grenfell is to ensure such homes are made safe, to ensure such a disaster can never happen again?
Absolutely. I've not seen the comments in those papers, but I think you're absolutely right. I'm concerned not just about the social housing where there's still ACM cladding, but the private housing where there's ACM cladding, but also you've been campaigning about the non-ACM combustible cladding, and you've been campaigning about the buildings short of 18 metres, 4 or 5 stories. We saw the fires in Barkingside and Worcester Park. I support your campaigning and your lobbying. It's really important we get the resolve sooner rather than later.
Well, thanks for that, because despite the government having banned ACM cladding in all buildings and are now consulting on lowering the threshold for combustible cladding to 11-metre high buildings, the government remediation fund is still only available for buildings of 18 metres or higher. As we've seen from the massive destruction in the recent Worcester Park fire and Barking Riverside fire, lower buildings can be at serious risk too. Do you agree remediation should not be limited only to a crude height threshold?
Absolutely, and I met some of those residents affected by both fires. There's also fires across the country. I met residents affected and campaigners, I beg your pardon, affected by the fire in Bolton, in the Cube building, student accommodation. The Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, and others have been doing a great piece of work on this area. Absolutely crucial. The speed of those fires spreading are really scary. There are videos of them spreading, but for the brilliance of the residents and the fire service, we could have had injuries and loss of life in those two fires. And there are thousands of buildings across our country which are combustible. Some have waking watches, some don't, and families live in fear going to bed every night.
Well, thanks for that. And lastly from me, the Building Safety Minister, Lord Greenhouse, last month told the MHCLG Select Committee that council should consider the compulsory purchase of private sector buildings where remediation is stalled. Do you agree this is a good idea, but could only work if the government provide the necessary funds for any CPO, which of course should reflect the low value of the unremediated freehold, and also the money to promptly complete the remediation works?
We've got to be a bit careful that we don't allow the government to deflect from their responsibility and to pass the buck. I'm all in favour of, if need be, there being CPOs either from the government or from the council, but you and I both know how long it takes and how expensive it is. And I think this is an excuse for the government not to take action. There's no reason for them to not to take action. There's no excuse for them not to take action urgently. What I don't want is them passing the buck to council or anybody else.
Well, thank you very much.
Right. Before we move on to the next question, can I just make very, very sincere plea from the chair on a couple of issues. One is that we're still getting quite a bit of background noise on the feed, so unless you're speaking, members, please make sure that your microphones are on mute. And second plea is that I am getting a bit of complaints about electioneering. May I remind everyone out there that election is still, many months away. Can we please not talk over each other and stick to the questions and answers so that, we give full justice to what they are meant for. Let's move on to next question, and that is from Assembly Member Duval, which is on finances of London, question number 2014.
Excuse me, Chair. I think it's my question next. Excuse me, Chair. It's Caroline Russell here.
I beg your pardon. Yes, it is question from Assembly Member Russell on cuts to borough transport, question number 1640. Apology for that.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I don't accept the premise of this question. The street space programme represents a substantial investment in walking and cycling in the capital. TfL's total borough funding for the next 6 months has increased from £48 million in their original budget to £54 million in the emergency budget. And more specifically, of this £54 million, TfL has ring-fenced £45 million for walking and cycling investment on London's borough roads. This is an increase from £35 million for schemes in the original budget. Many of these previous schemes are on pause while the government and TfL come to a joint financial settlement. TfL has allocated funding for over 500 borough projects across 24 boroughs worth £22 million. This includes 38 strategic cycle schemes, 114 low-traffic neighbourhoods, 154 school streets, and children to social distancing schemes within town centres across a range of inner and outer London boroughs. Further allocations will be made on a weekly basis. Our Street Space programme, a world-leading programme with international acclaim, will fast-track the transformation of many of London's roads, creating wider pavements for walking on and giving road space to new temporary cycle lanes. These locations will benefit from more space for walking and temporary cycle routes to reduce pressure on tube and buses, and will accelerate investment in clean, green and sustainable travel, ensuring it is at the heart of London's recovery. During lockdown, more Londoners have taken to walking and cycling as a safe way to undertake essential travel. As we emerge from lockdown, we believe walking could increase fivefold with cycling tenfold. On my behalf, TfL are working with London's boroughs to identify places where temporary changes are needed to support social distancing or that would benefit from cycling and walking improvements. Some of the temporary changes we're making could become permanent. This has all occurred in the context of a national effort to fight the virus, in support of which TfL has rapidly reduced its passenger numbers to levels not seen for 100 years. This has meant its fare and other revenue has fallen by 90%. And while enormous challenges remain, including agreeing longer-term sustainable funding for transport in the capital, I'm confident the Street Space programme will play a central role in delivering a successful recovery for our great city.
Mr. Mayor, thank you for that. But on Monday at Transport Committee, Simon Killenback confirmed to me that you've paused Healthy Streets investment, which was meant to be £417 million for this year. And now you've just got the street space of £80 million. Now that's in the TfL Healthy Streets budget. Now it looks like you're giving about 60 million of the 80 million street money to the boroughs, which seems like a generation. But their expected budget this year was £131 million. So that's effectively a cut to the boroughs of almost 70 million. Now what I'm worried about is, isn't in this borough funding gap a looming black hole that's going to land for walking and cycling?
Chair, I think I got most of that, but the technical hitches, there was some break. I think I got the gist. And the answer is no, we've not cut the money. Some of the money that isn't social distancing related or with this agenda has been paused, and because the focus has been, and the councils couldn't spend the money anyway, because the council's focus has been on programmes to encourage more walking and cycling and to make it easier for people to social distance. You'll be aware, the Assembly, because of the hearing this week with Simon Gillenback and Heidi and others, that we're in negotiations with the government in relation to the second half of the year. We're keen to make sure councils continue to have support they need to improve public transport in their areas.
The thing is, Mr. Mayor, you're absolutely dependent on the boroughs for delivering on walking and cycling across London. You really need to be fighting their corner with government to get them more funding. Not only are they dealing with public health, they're also trying to save their high streets. And in the longer term, they're going to want not just the temporary plastic measures, but they're going to want to have more permanent features as well. Now, in the context of these cuts, how are you going to keep up a pipeline of new permanent schemes?
So again, the gist of that question is I should be fighting harder for London. At the same time, as not fighting too hard, according to some Tory members of the Assembly, because we should be friendly with the government. Look, I will continue to be an advocate and champion for London to get its fair share, and that includes for public transport. I'm the biggest advocate for the work our councils do, not least because 95% of our roads are controlled by councils. So I'm keen to make sure, as I said in the original answer, that some of these temporary schemes become permanent schemes. I'm really keen to make sure we help our boroughs. And I've already announced today that 24 of our boroughs have come forward with plans which we're financially supporting. And on a weekly basis, I'll be making announcements of further partnership between us and these boroughs who did a brilliant job in short space of time already to transform more than 15,000 square metres of new walking and cycling, and as time goes on, there'll be more. And I think you're right, Member Russell, we want to get these plastic-type temporary barriers to be permanent, more attractive segregations between cyclists and vehicles.
Yeah, it's good you're making progress with the temporary schemes, but it feels like that pipeline is slow, and absolutely we need to get them more
We
permanent.
actually can't go faster, Chair, with respect.
Mr. Mayor, TfL studies show a potential growth in cycling to 10 times existing level. So now, doesn't that mean that you need big investment as well, like the new crossings of the Thames? Now, I wrote to your Deputy Mayor, Heidi Alexander, to prioritise shovel-ready schemes like the Cremorne Bridge, which runs from Wandsworth to Fulham, and also to give an update on your plans for a ferry at Rotherhithe to Canary Wharf. Will you push progress on those schemes now?
So the message from the government in relation to the first half of the financial deal was quite clear, in relation to only those that are quite advanced in relation to capital programmes and those with their contractual obligations. And so those are the priorities. we'll make sure in relation to...
Mr Mayor, I'm talking about the like Hammersmith Bridge as a shovel-ready project. You've been invited by the government to submit shovel-ready projects by this Thursday, by today, and the Cremorne Bridge, which I wrote to Deputy Mayor for Transport about, is could be one of those shovel-ready projects. Is that one that you're considering?
Well, I'll ask the question back. Is that project shovel-ready?
That project is shovel-ready. It has absolutely everything. It's all the consents. It's got a lot of community infrastructure levy. It's got consents from both Wandsworth and Fulham. It's absolutely ready to go and has been, actually. You could have had it. You could have cut the ribbon on it if you'd gone for it earlier on in this term.
Well, that's not in the submission to MHCLG today. The submission to MHCLG today does contain Hammersmith Bridge and other shovel-ready projects, but the other two that were referred to by Assemblymember Russell will be part of the negotiations we have with the DfT, which will be tough negotiations. I'm not going to pretend that the government's not being very difficult in relation to the monies they give to London going forward. We've tried to make sure we get as much support as you can from the government. And you'll be aware that the cost of COVID to TfL this year will be in the region of £4 billion, and so the priority's got to be what Simon Kimmelback referred to when he spoke to the Transport Committee, those projects which rather have contractual commitments are those projects which are almost completed.
Thank you, Ms Mayor. I'm out of time, but it would be very good if you can keep making that case to fill that looming black hole in the transport funding.
Right. Moving in the right order once again now. It is Assemblymember Duval. Your question is on finances of London. Question number 2014. Mr Mayor.
Thank you very much, Chair. Shall I move straight into asking questions? Because I think the Mayor has given the preliminary answer in previous questions, both in transport and on the general budget issues. If I can begin, Mr Mayor, let's go back to the budget guidance issue. I think in the priorities of yesterday, are they the priorities of today? If we thought the challenges of COVID-19 are challenging, do we think the economic downturn against the EU situation, trade wars going around the world, uncertainty is going to be the most challenging economic downturn we face, probably more so than the international crisis? So are you in a position just to say how much of the cuts that we're proposing to make will be for new areas of work or reprioritising your agenda within the GLA? I get this. I'll talk about priorities about what we need to protect. I'm trying to think about what are the challenges we're likely to face and where we have not got or we did not have plans pre-COVID-19 that we think we might be spending more time on.
Chair, can I just say, this is a really important issue. It's profound. I mean, it actually goes towards the future of our city. Because what the Assembly member has reminded all of us is what a game changer COVID-19 is. But on top of that, with the other uncertainties we've discussed in previous MQTs, and the short answer, Senator Duval, is, let me show you the additional issues we've got to now bear in mind. What will be the speed of economic recovery of our city? Because you know that the speed of economic recovery has a direct impact on a whole host of issues, not least council tax, business rates, revenues, but other issues as well. The second issue is the impact on London's businesses and council taxpayers. What levels of unemployment could there be? My fear is, and I read a lot of reports from economists and others, we could have unemployment levels not seen since the 1980s, not seen since a generation, and you will know the impact that has. But also, we have to be mindful of we're affected by decisions made by government in relation to what support they give us, not just paying the bill for COVID-19, but how they ameliorate the monies lost through business rates and council tax. But also, the reality is, whether we like it or not, and I know some members of the Assembly think it's a good thing, we will have a hard Brexit. There's a possibility, I hope very distinct, of there being no deal. But we can't disaggregate the impact of Brexit on potential transition and recovery and our future going forward. You've seen the reports this week, Senator Duval, of 1 in 6 jobs in culture being lost. When you bear in mind 1 in 6 jobs in London are in this area and they contribute £52 billion, you can imagine the impact it's going to have. So you're absolutely right to raise these questions. That's one of the reasons why I know the Chair of Budget Performance is understandably, and she's right to be, frustrated by the lack of information. It moves on a day-to-day basis because of the modelling we've got to do and the different permutations. But I will make sure I share with the Budget Performance Committee as soon as I can some of this stuff, because you're right, you need to know what sort of assessments we've made and the different calculations we're making. But just so you know, the two things that are coming around the corner which affect us is the government has indicated in July there'll be some sort of fiscal statement, not quite a budget, but a fiscal statement. That could have an impact in relation to us. And also we're told there could be a skills recovery fund in the next week or so. That has an impact on pivoting on new jobs, bearing in mind there could be mass unemployment. And that's why it's quite complicated. And you're right to remind us of the complications here.
And in terms of the budget advice, which is probably the most crucial one for not just in this year and for the following year budget, but for beyond, is really, and I've been critical of various bits of paper produced by the GLA in your name, which you sign up to, where I don't think we're painting enough pictures in describing some of the good work that is done within this organisation. It's too much just tables of figures and actually not an explanation of what those tables of figures deliver back into the communities of London or into services. So will we be working harder to paint those pictures in the future? And then lastly on this set of questions I've got, look, I know there's a crisis, do not get me wrong when I say this, but how are we flexibly going to be coping with not cutting too much too fast? In sense that, what do we have to do this year, next year, or the year beyond, and in terms of some of that redistribution that might need to take place into certain areas? How flexible do you think your system that you're going to have to propose to us in terms of doing that we're making any reductions at the right time and any of the investments at the right time?
Thank you, Chair. First, I think the constructive criticism in the spirit is intended, and that's 20 years of experience in the Assembly from Senator Duval. I think you're right, we could do a better job in painting a better picture of some of the things that we do from City Hall, and I include the Assembly, some of the things that we do from City Hall. For example, how many Londoners know of the work of Travel Watch that the Assembly helps fund? And so we need to do a better job at explaining some of the services we provide. You're right. One of the reasons why I'm keen, and my Chief of Staff and the CFO, David Galley and David Bellamy, are keen to publish the budget guidance as soon as possible, is to give the various departments in City Hall, and including the functional bodies like the NPS, LFB, development corporations and others, an opportunity to properly explain why they shouldn't be facing cuts going forward, bearing in mind what you talked about in relation to austerity. The priority's got to be keeping London safe, clearly, but we don't want to inadvertently, cut our nose to spite our face in relation to what makes London so special. What is our USP? Because that could lead to investments being spent elsewhere by businesses rather than London, because we aren't as attractive going forward. So I'm cognizant of what you said. I'll make sure I reflect on what you said, and I'll make sure that our team reflects upon some of the issues you've said. But also, you're aware, you can always offline speak to our team to make sure we do a better job of addressing some of your constructive criticism about how we can raise our game.
Mr. Mayor, thank you for that. I'm constantly wishing to speak, and anyone who has an ear roll about some of my views on budgeting, and I've been doing it openly and privately for some time. Can we now turn to priorities? Look, I'm very grateful that you earlier clarified the position on policing, because it's very important, policing investment in our capital, but also policing on the other side. So, some of that it's not softer side, some of that community infrastructure that maintains the fabric of our society. I get from the press release that fire is also a priority. I also see the name check around investment in skills. Are you going to be able to clarify in the coming months what else do you think is the front line, the protection of the front line, and how are you going to prioritise the questions that I sort of intimated earlier about when you need to change direction or maybe put more emphasis back into one particular service against the priority of another particular service? These are difficult choices politicians have to make, and I sadly think that we're going to be forced into making some very tough choices in the future. What can you say about what that front line looks like for you?
So a lot of this is contingent upon what deal we get from the government in relation to the MPS settlement for 21-22 and other settlements from the government, but also what the councils and City London Corporation tell us in relation to how much money they've recouped in relation to council tax and business rates, bearing in mind the concerns they've got because of COVID-19. One of the reasons why I'm keen to publish the budget guidance as soon as possible is to begin this conversation. I'm keen to hear from Assembly members and Londoners about your question about priorities. Clearly safety is a priority, but you remember from the exchanges we've had about prevention as well as cure. So you mentioned the fabric of our society, but also the fabric in relation to fighting crime. We wouldn't want to inadvertently cut issues that could stop the causes of crime being addressed by just focusing on the consequences of crime. And so those are some of the conversations we're going to have, and you'll be aware from the last 4 years that I've invested in, for example, the Young Londoners Fund, I've invested in the Violence Reduction Unit, I've invested in young people, but also invested in job creation. We've got devolution of the adult education budget. I'm aware from speaking to business leaders that they are now consulting on redundancies. If jobs are going to be lost, I think we should be, as soon as possible, retraining them into future-proof jobs, but also green jobs going forward. So those are some of the conversations we're having, but I will begin a dialogue not just with the Assembly, but from other Londoners and stakeholders as well.
Thank you.
We now have a question from Assembly Member Prince, which is about modern slavery statement. Question number 1716.
Thank you, Chair. Modern slavery is a horrendous crime which affects some of the most vulnerable people in London. The GLA MOPAC, Greater London Authority Holdings Limited and GLA Land and Property Limited all have robust modern slavery statements in place, which sets out the steps we take to make sure our supply chains are free from slavery and human trafficking. They are updated annually. In my police and crime plan, I made a clear commitment to support partnerships that will stamp out modern slavery in the capital, and I remain committed to this. I established the London Modern Slavery Partnership Board, which brings together partners from all sectors to share intelligence and best practice and pool resources. This is now partnered with the London Leeds Network of local authority representatives and London councils, so that good practice is shared across London. To ensure that London is leading the national effort, my Deputy Mayor and London's Victims Commissioner regularly meet with Dame Sarah Thornton, the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner. Last year I provided £10,000 to support the Modern Slavery Helpline operated by the charity Unseen, and I've matched this again this year. This provides vital advice to victims and is a valuable source of intelligence for police forces as they continue to offer a vital service during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm concerned that as lockdown begins to ease, the number of people being exploited could rise as businesses begin to reopen. As the charity Hestia has highlighted, there is a particular risk because some businesses are likely to be looking for ways to cut costs in a difficult economic climate. However, the Met will keep bearing down on perpetrators of modern slavery. Their Modern Slavery Child Exploitation Unit has around 100 officers working on this issue. Recently, their Modern Day Slavery Investigation Team carried out a day of action targeting the sexual exploitation of women at brothels in Westminster. This resulted in 6 arrests and led to a second investigation focused on perpetrators using the proceeds of crime to fund their luxurious lifestyles. I'll continue to work closely with the Met, local authorities and charitable sector to tackle this dreadful issue.
Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Absolutely welcome everything that you do on modern day slavery, and as you probably know, I'm a big supporter of the work that is done in this area. My question, Mr. Mayor, is do you agree, and I think from what you've said earlier you do, that forcing someone to work under threat of suspension or pay when ill, or when given medical advice to self-isolate, or when lacking life-saving protective equipment, might constitute a form of forced labour as defined under the Modern Slavery Act?
Firstly, can I thank you for your commitment to this area? It's a really good example of cross-party working. From what you've said, I think that would be not acceptable. It shouldn't be done.
Thank you. Would you agree also, Mr. Mayor, that if bus drivers were forced to work when they were sick, there should be serious consequences?
Yeah, one of the things that we did early doors is, you'll be aware, there are 10 big bus operators. We made sure that they were shielding vulnerable bus drivers, and by vulnerable bus drivers I include not just those who are older, but those who have underlying health conditions. No bus driver who is vulnerable or is at risk of suffering the worst consequences of catching COVID-19 should feel forced to work. We also did this with our cleaners. They're not our cleaners, they're employed by private companies. We also made sure their pay was guaranteed so they wouldn't inadvertently feel they've got to work when they shouldn't be.
I'm glad you mentioned the cleaners, Mr. Mayor, because quite rightly, within the modern slavery statement, we do, or you do, identify cleaners as one of those areas that should be protected. So, as bus companies are contractors, subcontractors, do you not think we should include bus drivers under your umbrella of protection, Mr. Mayor?
So we don't employ the bus drivers, but we're quite clear with the bus operators what expected of them, just like we don't employ the cleaners directly. We're quite clear in relation to what our expectations are, and by and large the bus operators have been really good. I know Gareth Powell talked about this when he came before the Transport Committee earlier on this week, a number of good questions about this. So we are keen to make sure that all the people we've got contracts with as part of the procurement understand the responsibilities we expect of them.
But in the statement, Mr. Mayor, you quite rightly identify cleaners as being a prime risk. But should we not also bring under your umbrella, because I think, you know, we would all welcome it and the unions would welcome it, bus drivers as well, because there's a large proportion of BAME in that area. There are a lot of people at risk, and, you know, do you not think we should just add them into?
Just to reassure you, not only have we got above and beyond any transport authority in the country in relation to safety of bus drivers, I've also commissioned UCL, the Institute of Equity there, led by Sir Michael Moorman, to do a piece of really serious independent work, reassuring us that we're doing all we can, as you're concerned about as well, to make sure our bus drivers are safe, but also come back with recommendations about what more we can do. That's notwithstanding the fact that they're not employed by us. But no, sorry, I don't want to give an impression that we don't care about them. The fact they're employed by independent companies is irrelevant. We really do care about them.
No, that's the point, Mr. Mayor. I know you do care about them, and I absolutely accept that you genuinely care about them. And all I'm asking is, can we make it a more formal protection under you, Mr. Mayor, to review the statement and possibly include them in the statement?
Chair, why don't I arrange for Heidi to speak to Keith Prince, because as ever he's got good ideas. So could I offline resolve this? And I'm sure we'll address the concern you've raised, because they're often good concerns. And let me ask Heidi to look into this, please, Chair.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, next question is from Assembly Member Cooper, and that is on EU deal and London's economy. Question number 1905.
Thank you, Chair. The COVID-19 pandemic poses a grave threat to Londoners' jobs and livelihoods, with the prospect of a domestic and global recession now hanging over us. Most Londoners will be deeply disappointed that at a time of crisis, the government is putting dogma ahead of the national interest by refusing to extend the transition period with the EU. No one could have anticipated that the key negotiations would take place at a time when the UK and the EU are rightly focused on fighting a global pandemic. The last thing that Londoners need as we try to get back on track following the devastation wreaked by the coronavirus is the chaos that will result from the failure to agree a trade deal. That's why I've written to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Michael Gove, urging the government to put political ideology aside and pursue the pragmatic route of seeking an extension to the negotiations. This would mean that we and our European partners could focus our efforts on recovery from COVID-19, the biggest health, social and economic emergency we've faced since the Second World War.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And many Londoners have written to me saying that they're very pleased that you've written in those terms, because they do feel that this is a great danger. When, I don't think anyone's trying to unpick Brexit. That is quite clearly going to occur. But at the time when we set the date for the exit on the 31st of December, nobody, I think, had any concept that a pandemic was going to happen. So I don't think it's just dogma, as you said. Would you agree with me that sticking blindly to the date of the 31st of December and not revisiting it in the light of the incredible crisis that we're in is actually ideological idiocy? And would you be surprised to know that the Deputy Chair of the Economy Committee yesterday voted in favour of sticking with that timing?
Well, I'm going to be very careful, because the Chair might tell me off for saying anything that could enhance my chances of winning next May or reduce the chances of the current Tory candidate winning next May. So I'll stay in order and not deal with your final point. But in relation to Brexit, look, we've left the EU. We have left the European Union. We left on the 31st of January. What we had, though, is a transition period up until the end of this year to do a deal with the EU. And the reality is, I've seen for myself the fact that the bandwidth of our government has been focused on dealing with COVID-19, as indeed it has for European Union governments as well, including the EU. And so very little time has been focused on getting a good trade deal for either side. And so the point I made, and you sort of alluded to this, is there's a pragmatic reason for seeking an extension. We're going to go back and re-enter the EU. So there's no reason for the leavers to panic about that, or the Brexiteers. This is about a pragmatic decision to extend the transition period to make sure there's sufficient time to negotiate this really, really complex deal. As I'm seeing later on today, President Macron, who is awarding our city the highest order France can give for our efforts during the Second World War. I'm afraid I won't get a chance to discuss negotiations with him. But as an example of, we still have really good fraternal relations with our European colleagues, and it's in everyone's interest to still do a good deal with the European Union, which will mean that the consequences of COVID-19 on our city won't be compounded by a bad deal or even, God forbid, no deal.
Mr. Mayor, yesterday we heard from the London Chamber of Commerce, who said that Brexit is an existential threat for many businesses across London. I'm sure you've heard what Caroline Fairbairn from the Confederation of British Industry has said. So this is not just people from one part of the political spectrum. This is many businesses saying that a no-deal Brexit is going to be an appalling threat to them, on top of what is clearly turning into a major recession due to this pandemic. And yet we see that members of this Assembly are spending more time worried about an increase in the congestion charge from £11.50 to £15 a day, which has businesses been raising with you. The issue of a no-deal Brexit or the increase in the congestion charge? Which are they saying is the greater threat to their ongoing existence?
Well, I speak regularly to business groups and businesses. In the last 2 weeks alone, I've spoken to the CBI, London First, London Chamber of Commerce, FSB, and many others as well. I think they're all concerned in relation to a no-deal Brexit. It would be, in my view, the biggest act of economic self-harm ever committed by our government. And I think those who seek to represent our city need to understand that actually one of our roles in City Hall is in relation to the economic prosperity and well-being of our city. And that's why we are making the case gently and politely to the government. Let's make sure we don't inadvertently end the transition period on the 31st of December without any deal whatsoever, which would be catastrophic for our businesses, which would make, I talked about a potential of mass unemployment because of COVID-19. Can you imagine, on top of that, no deal with our biggest trading partner? It'd be catastrophic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And the Economy Committee yesterday decided that it would join you in writing to the government to try and see if this could be avoided. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you.
Right, members, Mr. Mayor. Next question, number 1676 is withdrawn as they are out of time. So we swiftly move on to a question from Assembly Member Boff, which is on overcrowded housing and COVID-19. Question number 1693.
Thank you, Chair. COVID-19 has highlighted some of the consequences of London's housing crisis, which has been decades in the making. Too many Londoners are having to live in unsuitable and overcrowded homes, with many now facing an increased risk of homelessness due to the economic impact of the coronavirus. Many of the homes that are overcrowded are privately rented. While I have no formal powers in this area, I'm doing everything I can to improve standards for renters. Our Better Renting programme aims to increase the capacity of local authority enforcement teams to help them to tackle poor conditions in the private rented sector, including overcrowding. Whilst this will go some way to supporting those living in overcrowded substandard accommodation, much more could be done to address overcrowding in the private rented sector through property licensing. However, to enable local authorities to use these powers effectively, it's vital that the government ensures they're properly resourced. The highest rates of overcrowding are in the social housing sector, a consequence of years of much needed social rented homes being lost, when homes are sold through right to buy and not replaced, as well as a chronic lack of funding from the government to build the new socially rented housing London desperately needs. We've been working to turn things around in London, and we're now delivering record numbers of social rented and other genuine affordable homes, with over 17,000 homes started in last year, the highest since records began. This includes over 7,000 homes at social rent levels, more in 1 year than in the entirety of the previous mayor's second term. My London plan aims to ensure that any new social housing helps to tackle overcrowding. For the first time, we're requiring boroughs to set out the size mix of social housing needed in their area. While the progress we've made will enable more households to access a safe and secure home they can afford, the reality is that a significant increase in funding from central government is needed to deliver the homes London needs.
Assembly Member Buff.
Thank you, Chair. Inside housing has shown a clear link between hotspots of COVID-19 deaths and overcrowding. Will you review your housing and planning programmes in that light?
Firstly, you're right. There is clearly a link between overcrowded housing, poverty, deprived communities, ethnicity, underlying health conditions, and the disproportionate number of deaths in black Asian Irish ethnics from COVID-19. As far as the London plan and the housing strategy is concerned, we're quite clear in relation to actually being ahead of the curve in relation to addressing some of the concerns there are. For example, minimum space requirements, for example, design quality, for example, making sure we address some of the issues in relation to poor quality homes that you're talking about.
Thank you for describing the current plan, and I appreciate that. But I want to know whether or not you will review your housing and planning programmes in the light of our experience over the past few months.
Well, the current London plan, as you know, is with MHCLG. We're in negotiations with the MHCLG in relation to the London plan.
Is that you will review or you won't review?
The point I was making when you interrupted my first answer was we don't think there's a reason to make any changes to the London plan because we're ahead of the curve because we've already addressed some of the concerns that were in the previous London plan that led to the issues that you're talking about.
So you won't review the planning and housing programmes despite the experiences of people living in overcrowded conditions over the past few months, but you won't review the plans, and you're on the record saying.
I think what you're missing is what the evidence from Public Health England and others is, which is one of the explanations for the high levels of deaths amongst black, Asian, minority ethnic people across the country is the issue of not just ethnicity, some of the work they do, some of the jobs they're in, they're poorer families, they live in deprived communities, the fact that they're in zero-hours contract, many of them, they have underlying health conditions. Very few of those things are addressed by a London plan or a housing strategy. Yes, the issue of overcrowded housing is, which is why we're seeking to address that in relation to the housing strategy by having far more council homes, far more socially rented homes, and far more genuinely affordable homes, which is one of the best ways to address the issue of overcrowding. We're not seeking to change those in the London plan or the housing strategy.
Well, Mr. Mayor, there are many people watching here from ethnic minorities who've suffered very badly as a result of this virus.
And many of them are the legacies of the previous mayor's housing policies. I mean, you know, for example, last year we began more socially rented homes last year at 7,000 than the previous mayor's entire term. You will know, for example, we began more council homes last year than any year since 1984. You'll also be aware that last year we began more genuinely affordable homes than any year since records began. So we're addressing the very issues.
You will not be reviewing your housing and planning plan. The fact of the matter is that despite...
So I'm really confident that we're addressing some issues with more government support. I'm hoping you'll help me lobby the government for more...
Can I please apologise, but Assembly Member Buff, you're out of time, so sorry, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you. Right, moving on to next question, which is from Assembly Member McCartney, and that is on support for increased cycling in London. Question number 2022.
Thank you, Chair. Our streets-based plan is transforming hundreds of kilometres of streets across London to enable millions more journeys to be made by bike. TfL's modelling suggests we need to accommodate a possible tenfold increase in cycling as lockdown restrictions are eased. We've already built new segregated cycle lanes on Park Lane and upgraded sections of the previously unsegregated cycle street Highway 8. We've restarted construction work on cycleways 4 and 9, and will complete them as fast as possible by making use of temporary materials. Work has started on Hampstead Road and will start soon to upgrade cycle street Highway 7 and build new routes between Hackney, the Isle of Dogs, and Dalston and Lee Bridge. Working with the boroughs, we've already begun allocating funding from the government's emergency funding and are seeing changes on the ground, including a Kew Road closure in Hounslow on Cycleway 9, Lambert's first emergency low traffic neighbourhood in Oval, and protected space for cycling on Uxbridge Road in Ealing and on the A10 in Enfield. We've secured £55 million in the first 6 months of the funding agreement with the government. This is going to deliver change at an unprecedented rate on our streets. If we're to continue the current pace of change and succeed in preventing a car-paced recovery, we need support in 2 key areas. First, we need to be working with all London boroughs, not just the coalition of the willing, who have already started taking action. Those councils who have in the past been anti-cycling and anti-walking. We need you to work with us. Second, we need continued financial support from the government. The funding to cover the first 6 months of our street space plan is welcome, but is nowhere near enough to enable the scale of change we need to see right across our city.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Currently, because of the COVID-19 crisis, TfL is not undertaking any cycle training. But Cycling UK have recently said that new guidelines mean it would be possible to provide cycle training in groups of up to 6 outdoors and still maintain social distancing. Is that TfL's understanding? And if so, will they be starting cycle training shortly?
That is correct. That is our understanding, and hopefully they'll begin shortly. I'm told maybe as soon as later on this month.
Thank you. You've also been on record as stating there could be a possible 10-fold increase in cycling as lockdown restrictions are eased. Obviously, cycle training is going to be vitally important because we will have many new cyclists on the road and they need to be safe. What plans do you have to extend cycle training and bikeability training more wider to cater for those new cyclists?
One of the things that the Walking Cycling Commissioner, Will Norman, is doing with Heidi Alexander, the Deputy Mayor, is negotiating with the government to enable us to have access to some of the funding we need for cycle training, really important, particularly for adult cyclists who are cycling for the first time or returning to cycling. So we're working on some face-to-face training supplemented by virtual training as well, some modules, and we're hoping to have agreement for the government to have some funding to do the cycle training as soon as possible.
Thank you for that, because I had noticed that cycle training had been allocated for areas outside London, but not for London itself. Now, the deal that you had to sign with government to get TfL through this interim period mentions £55 million for active travel. Do you yet know how much of that you can devote to cycle training?
So some of the negotiations that Will Norman is doing with the government is to, as you said, get some of this towards cycle training. The figure we say we need to really make a difference is £4 million. So we'd be hoping that £4 million of money could be allocated to this really important area of cycle training. I'm quite keen, as you know, I've supported this area in the past. There was a pause for obvious reasons, and so I'm hoping that we can spend £4 million on this area as soon as possible.
Thank you, that's really helpful to know, and I'll pass that on to the many cycle trainers who has been lobbying me, and I'm assuming other Assembly members, on this issue. Thank you.
Me too.
Right. Can the Assembly agree to suspend Standing Order 2.9b in accordance with the provisions of Standing Order 1.1h in order to allow the remaining business on the agenda to be completed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to the next question then, which is from Assembly Member Gavron, and that's on international cooperation and COVID-19 initiatives. Question 2019, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. Tackling a global pandemic is a monumental challenge that transcends national and city boundaries. In London, as we have done ever since the start of this crisis, we'll continue to work with other major cities to identify and share the most effective actions we can take to ensure the recovery does not involve a return to business as usual. And while it's crucial that we focus on the emergency response, we also need to plan for the future. This will be a team effort involving City Hall, London councils, national government, businesses, charities, the NHS, major institutions like universities, and of course, Londoners. The scale of the challenge can't be underestimated. We already have experts warning this economic shock will be more severe than the global financial crash of 2018 that led to a crisis. And that's without the added and unnecessary risk of a chaotic hard Brexit. We will see certain sectors of the economy, such as hospitality and tourism, particularly badly hit. And we will likely see levels of unemployment that we haven't experienced since the 1980s. To help us step up to the challenge, I've set up a recovery board, which I chair with the chair of London Councils, Councillor Peter John, and which includes representation from local and central government to provide a strategic steer to the work of the task force. And it's already provided a strong steer that the programme must, at its heart, address equalities, environment and health, be innovative, affordable and led by both data and the experience of Londoners. We're embarking on unprecedented engagement with Londoners to gather their aspirations for the city as we come out of this crisis. But this will also mean a dialogue with the government about the need for further devolution to bring London more in line with other global cities like New York, Tokyo and Paris. The decisions we'll need to take during the recovery, from addressing inequality to skills and housing shortages, are best taken at a local level where they're best understood.
Well, thank you for that very comprehensive answer. Thank you. I wanted to say that all over the world now, cities, as you pointed out, are grappling with huge rises in unemployment. And tragically, this is going to impact most on young Londoners, I think, who are, long-term impact, who are already feeling pretty despondent about their future. And this week, the GLA Economics announced that, and it was this week, yes, this week they announced that we would be losing in this year 500,000 jobs. Now, here's an idea. The Shadow Business Secretary has suggested the creation of a zero carbon army of young people. And as I said, it's going to impact mostly on young people, certainly on their long-term prospects. And there's a huge potential here for new jobs in retrofit, in construction, in nature conservation. There are others as well. So my question is, when you put into the statement that the fiscal statement that's coming out in next month from the Chancellor, are you going to ask for job creation schemes for young people, and particularly for green job creation schemes?
Actually, so these are some of the conversations I've been having with the Metro 9 mayors across the country, because they also want to do this as well, but also they, like me, think they're best placed to do this rather than civil servants in Whitehall. And part of it is what you've said, the job creation schemes. Part of it is reskilling or skilling up people, Londoners, to have the skills for these jobs. And some of the other areas are, for example, electrifying transport potentially. Some of the other areas are expanding community energy, touched upon retrofitting programs. And so we're quite keen for the government to devolve to us further resources and powers to do just that. We've got adult education, but also we're keen to make sure other areas we can get resources to help them have the skills for the jobs that could be created. I want a green recovery, a sustainable recovery, and not a return to business as usual.
Yes. Well, here's one suggestion that you might want to put to him, which is that the eco-funding that currently is a levy on all our household electricity and gas bills and goes to the utilities is taken from the utilities and given to you. Then London might get its fair share, which would amount to about 100 million a year, and in fact would be a very helpful stimulus for a much more expanded retrofit programme. But that's just a suggestion. But I wanted to get on to another question, which is that this is a quote, and it really, in a sense, reinforces what you've just been saying. And it's a quote from Downing Street, and it goes like this, that to get this country back on its feet, we need mayors to be at the forefront of the local recovery. Now, you've made that stress. It's cities that know their local needs. And currently, and that was said by Downing Street, I think, after you and the other metro mayors had met the Prime Minister. So that was last month. Now, currently, I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that that local government, city government, is handcuffed to central government. And if you're going to get those freedoms, those powers, those finances, you're going to need help with that. And I'm just wondering exactly what you might be asking for, so that we can not just build to the world that we came from, build a recovery to the world that was, but build forward to a new and more equitable and, if possible, green recovery.
There's various points one made, Chair. So firstly, I like the idea of the eco-levy being spent where it's raised. You'll be aware the government tends to tax Londoners and spend it elsewhere. I'll make sure my team makes a note of us making representations around eco-levy. In relation to not returning to the world as it was, I'm keen to avoid a car-led recovery. That's why it's really important that the Assembly supports me where they can in relation to more walking, more cycling, and making the temporary changes permanent where we can. But also you'll be aware, Senator McGavran, that the previous Mayor commissioned a London Finance Commission cross-party group of experts and some who are apolitical to come up with recommendations which we've updated. I'm hoping the current Prime Minister, bearing in mind he was the person that commissioned London Finance Commission, understands that we need far more devolution to London to give us the powers to do many of the things that you say. You're right, I was present at the M9 phone call with the Prime Minister. I'll also be taking part later on today with a phone call with M9 colleagues, with the Chancellor, and we'll be lobbying him to devolve to us the powers and the resources to make sure we can, have a transition and a recovery that is a new normal, that isn't going to return to business as usual. That means devolving powers to us around skills, around job creation, around infrastructure and other areas where we currently haven't got the powers and resources we desperately need. It isn't just a London issue, it's an issue for all the cities and regions across our country.
Thank you.
Right, let's move on to next question, which is from Assembly Member Qureshi. That is on homelessness and COVID-19. Question 2056. Mr. Mayor.
There's a serious risk that many more Londoners will face homelessness over the coming months. As things stand, private renters may face eviction when the government lifts its temporary ban. Those who've stayed with family or friends through lockdown may no longer be able to, and victims of domestic abuse and fleet situations they've endured over the last few months, and rough sleepers who spent lockdown in hotels will need accommodation. We must act now to spare these Londoners from homelessness and to prevent already stretched services being overwhelmed. I'm doing what I can to ensure Londoners who've benefited from recent special measures aren't abandoned. Our rough sleeping team is working with charities to get in place the accommodation and support needed for our sleepers when they leave the hotels we've provided. This includes securing social and private rented accommodation and supported housing, and making sure people can access urgently needed immigration advice. We're also working with the police and with councils to tackle illegal evictions.
Assembly Member Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for the response. The government has extended the eviction period by 2 months, but the announcement I want to focus on is the announcement that homeowners, including landlords with buy-to-let mortgages, will still be able to take mortgage holidays in the coming months. Yet renters, those who may well be tenants of these landlords, do not get the same relief. Do you think it's right that someone who may have been laid off because of COVID or ill must keep up the payments on their homes as they're privately renting, but if they are owners, they don't have to?
It's inequitable and unfair, particularly as those arrears will accrue. You mentioned one group of people. Also, students are really worried because students are having to pay rent, even though the landlord may be receiving the mortgage payment holiday you referred to. Even though students are returning to university because of COVID-19, so there are a number of areas where the government's really got to look at the unfairness built into the support they're giving.
That's true. And what can we? How can we actually help these households from falling behind in their rents and facing evictions? I mean, for example, in my home borough, the City of Westminster, a two-bed flat is about £1,000 more than the local housing allowance, and there's clearly something's got to give.
So what's happening? You're absolutely right. The gap between the allowance tenants in your borough received and the rent was often met with them working. Many of them now can't work. Even if they're furloughed, there's a reduction in the salary they received, and those debts are accruing. And so we've had a number of asks from government, what we call the triple lock. Firstly, for them to increase the national cap on the local housing allowance. Secondly, for there to be no evictions as a consequence of arrears, and the government could meet the gap between the benefits received and the rent being paid to avoid that happening. But thirdly, we need to make sure that there's no evictions because of either no-fault evictions or because of so-called Section 8 notices because of arrears being built up. Very simple things the government could do to allay the concerns of those residents of yours who are so anxious at the moment because they're worried once the period ends in August, they could be facing eviction from their properties.
Indeed, and you're right, and I'm grateful for the triple lock approach you're taking for the 3 million private renters that we have in London. Let's not forget social renters are also struggling during the crisis, and I'm concerned that big HAs may use rent arrears as a means of eviction. Would you agree that no social landlord should be evicting their tenants without giving the judges the proper basis on which to judge those cases, then making them mandatory?
Absolutely. I mean, particularly bringing in mind what the mission statement of registered social landlords is. It's really important they are mandatory, and the judge can see what the circumstances were. It's really important.
Okay, thank you very much.
Cheers, thank you.
Right. Members, we have question number 1717, which we are not going to take as Conservative group are out of time. Similarly, question number 1846 is also out of time, so we are not taking that question. Assembly Member Desai, I believe you're having some difficulties with IT system. Are you here with us?
I think I'm okay now. Can you see me, Chair?
You're okay.
I can hear, Chair, I can hear this room now.
That's great. I can see him as well now. Thank you very much.
I can't see the mayor, but I can see you, Chair, and some other colleagues.
Right, okay.
Can I just say, Chair, it's the Assembly member's loss if he can't see me. Can I answer his question? Which is the Secretary of State's decision to grant planning permission on the 14th of January 2020 was the subject of legal challenges by the GLA and the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. I'm pleased that the High Court has decided to quash the decision, and this was the correct decision in the circumstances. The government needs to handle this matter with the utmost transparency. This decision makes it clear that the principles of judicial review can be relied upon to ensure the lawfulness and fairness of any subsequent redetermination of this planning application in the normal way. My planning team will liaise with the planning inspectorate in relation to the procedure for redetermining the planning application.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, however, things have now moved on. And this is more than just a question of who decides on the application. There are issues here of probity, transparency, and accountability. And on the 11th of June, it was the Shadow Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government raised an urgent question in Parliament about the case and probity in the planning system. Now, and I can also thank Tower Hamlets Council for bringing this legal challenge. It's their challenge that has led to what is now a national scandal. I'm limited in the scope of my questioning, both by time and also the lack of immunity that parliamentarians get. So I want to really ask you two questions. The first question is, Mr. Mayor, you yourself often play a role in the planning system like that of the Secretary of State in making decisions on call-deed applications. Would you feel comfortable making a decision involving an applicant who you had conversations with without at the very least disclosing the dates and contents of any correspondence?
Thank you, Chair. Look, transparency, accountability and public scrutiny are really important in all that we do, and that includes planning applications as well. I've asked, since I've been there, GLA officers to include specific reference in our planning reports to any request for or against call-ins or a direction to refuse, whether formal or informal. I take my quasi-judicial function really seriously, and it's really important there is maximum transparency.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, I was first made aware of this situation in May 2016 when a local councillor expressed his worries to me about the relationship between your predecessor and the developers. We now know from the Times newspaper that your predecessor, who's now Prime Minister, met the developer 3 times. There are other issues as well. Mr. Robert Jendrick sharing a table with the developer at a Conservative Party fundraiser. These are issues that are written to the police about that actually need investigation. I must say, Mr. Mayor, that I've not been satisfied with the police response at all. I feel that they should investigate whether an offence of misconduct in public office may have taken place, but they've stated that they feel there are insufficient grounds to conduct a full criminal investigation. Given what information is in the public domain, I feel the matter have not fully justified decision, so I wrote to you yesterday requesting that you seek a full explanation from the Met as to why they've chosen not to pursue this case. Mr. Mayor, can I ask you to request these details from the Met with regards to this matter, and also I look forward to hearing back from you in due course.
Chair, can I just be quite clear in my answer, and I'm going to be very careful in what I say for reasons that are obvious. But in a previous answer, I talked about the importance of making sure there's proper checks and balances with the police. I just think it'd be improper for a politician to exert any pressure on the police when it comes to operational decisions. I've not seen the letter yet from Senator Desai, and I'm just answering in a hypothetical scenario. I've been quite clear in my role as the mayor, and the previous mayor was criticised for being seen to interfere in how the police operate. I'm keen to make sure that I don't interfere, and I take my responsibility really seriously. But let me see the letter, because I don't want to be unfair to this member, because he simply asked me to look into whether. Let me see the letter, Chair, and then I'll respond in due course to the letter.
Sure, Mr. Mayor, can I put on record that I'm not asking any of you to put pressure on the police or interfere in any way, but what it is, we need to know from the police why they are not pursuing this investigation. Who have they interviewed? Have they asked for the correspondence that Tower Hamlets Council have asked for and is being withheld by the government? They could explain their decision, the reasoning behind their decision not to pursue this matter further. Lord Adonis has a similar dismissive response. So all I'm asking you to do is to look at, consider my email and ask questions of the police. But I'm not saying that you should put any sort of pressure on them. Not at all. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Chair.
Right. We've got practically no time left. Assembly Member Cooper, do you want to still pursue your question? Assembly Member Cooper.
Yes, sorry, I just unmuted myself. I think the point that I'm trying to make is that we need to be looking at air quality issues, carbon intensity issues, and also looking at other ways to dispose of waste rather than always expanding incinerator capacity. Would you agree with that, Mr. Mayor?
Thank you, Chair. I mean, some of you will know from the brilliant work she's done over the last 4 years that the UK has now gone 2 months without coal in our energy mix, which is a huge achievement, and you're absolutely right. And so we're trying to make sure we do what we can to, rather than have more incinerators, to reduce the amount of waste that goes to landfill or burning. Where there has to be incinerators, that we can use the heat to make energy, and if we can divert more waste to be recycled rather than to incinerators.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The time's up. And that brings us to the conclusion of questions to the Mayor. May I thank Mr. Mayor for your answers. Thank you very much. Right. Can I ask the Assembly to agree the motion which is set out on the agenda in my name, which is that the Assembly notes the answers to the questions asked?
Agreed. Chair.
Can I have a response?
I had laid a amendment, right, to that motion, which I want to move.
Right. Okay. We have received the amendment. And do you want to read out the amendment?
I will, Chair. I'm just going to, for the benefit of members of the public watching at home, I'm just going to read the amendment to the motion in the name of the Chair. The amendment is being moved by Dr Sahota, Assembly Member Dr Sahota, and is being seconded by Assembly Member Arnold, and they will make their speeches shortly. But just to read the text of the amendment, which has also been emailed to all Assembly members. So the amendment is to add text after the wording that the Assembly notes the answers to the question asked. The additional text then reads, we also note the Mayor's report and its particular reference to the Black Lives Matter protests here and in the United States. We are appalled by the events leading to the death of George Floyd and add our voices to the global condemnation of his murder. We recognise that many of the concerns held by those protesting in the US, for example regarding institutional racism, are shared by black communities in this country and that there is a great feeling of injustice. We stand shoulder to shoulder with black Londoners in asserting their fundamental right to raise significant issues concerning their community. We firmly believe that equality and opportunity are not for the select few. Our work as members of this Assembly must be to play a role in ensuring racism and discrimination are challenged and eradicated. This means adding our voices to concerns such as the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on BAME people, as well as scrutinising the effect on these communities of inequality, whether it be economic in the application of the law or in opportunity.
Right. I do have a list here in terms of the mover, the seconder, and the rest of running order. Can I please, I can still hear some not particularly interesting background noises. Please keep your microphones on mute mode if you're not speaking. Can I invite Dr. Onkar Sahota to move the amendment, please? And you have everyone participating. Please, you have 5 minutes maximum. We don't have to use all of that. Thank you. Dr. Sahota.
Great. Thank you, Chair. It isn't very often that we move to amend your motion, which notes the answers given by the Mayor to the questions asked. But this is not ordinary times, and I hope that, Mr. Chair, that you will forgive me for moving this amendment, noting that these are extraordinary times and a special occasion. This is the first time that the Assembly has come together since those life-changing events and those transformational events that have taken place in the world. This is the first time that we've had an opportunity to comment on the response right across the world to the death of George Floyd. And I know that you attempted to put together a motion on behalf of the Assembly to give a voice to the feelings of Londoners, but this didn't come to fruition because of a lack of unanimity amongst the group leaders. I'm not going to name the group leaders. They know who they are. But I hope they've reflected on their actions and that they will join us today in showing a collective and a united voice on behalf of Londoners against racism that may exist and that exists in society. And I know that we were grappling in London with issues like, why is it that 93% of the doctors who died in the COVID-19 pandemic were from the BME community? We were grappling with the questions of why 67% of people from the health and social care sector who died were from the BME community. We were grappling from the fact that why is it that Bangladeshis living in London are twice the risk of dying from COVID-19 compared to their white counterparts. We were grappling with the fact that why is it that other BME communities have a risk of between 10 to 50% of dying from COVID-19. We were grappling with the fact, why is it that the BME community were represented more and disproportionately in the low-paid frontline jobs, which exposed them to COVID-19 more than others. And in the midst of this, we saw pictures, a 9-minute video of George Floyd dying under the knee of a white police officer, whilst 3 police officers stood by doing nothing. That was a most uncomfortable video. It held a mirror up to society, up to all of us. It was uncomfortable for all of us to watch. It stood a mirror to us to reflect on what society we live in. What we were witnessing was a black person dying whilst 4 police officers did this, and 3 of them stood by doing nothing about it. And his words, his 3 words, I can't breathe, became amplified and resonated right across the world. Those 3 words represented how black people were feeling right across the world. Those 3 words is a damnation of the racism that goes on in our society, of how we become, some ways, we ignore the things happening in front of our eyes. It woke us up. And I know that it is clear that the issue of institutional and anti-black racism is a reality, not just in the in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom. Black communities in this country are standing up against the deep injustice of racism and inequalities that we have in our society, from the economy, to the application of the law, to housing, to education. And as we can see all too plainly with COVID-19, also health, there's really no area of society where we do not see this impact of racial inequality. The London Assembly must stand shoulder to shoulder with black Londoners. We must make sure that those are not just empty words. Those are not the words which we are using because these are trending on Twitter accounts. But this is something which we will take into our daily lives and reflect on them and do something about them. So I welcomed the Mayor referencing Black Lives Matter in his report, and that we stand with black Londoners. Not just today, not just tomorrow, not just when I say, well, this has been trending on Twitter account, but for every day in our actions and every day in the ways we reflect on the things we do in society. And I think that's very important that we listen to what's been said by the Black Lives movement, and that we reassure people, reassure the black people in this great city that we are standing with them, we are listening to what they're saying, and that we are sending a message out of our unity, of our understanding, and of our disgust as what's happened right across the world and what happens in our society. And therefore I am pleased to move this motion on behalf of the Labour group and hope that the Assembly can support it, and I commend this to the Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I have Assembly Member Janet Arnold seconding this motion. Do you want to speak now?
Yes, I do, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, it's an honour to speak to this motion and to follow the marvellous good doctor. Like him and many of our colleagues, we have spent our lives working to end racial inequality. Colleagues, I wish I had £1 for every time I have spoken against racial inequality. Racial inequality, I would argue, is the other pandemic that blights our society. And do please accept my apologies if I just repeat anything that my good colleague has said, but it's worth repeating. so we can all get a sense of the enormity of the task ahead if we are to cure the disease of racism. Twice as many Londoners of colour live in poverty. 1 in 8 live in overcrowded homes. Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth. Each time public attention turns to one of the many injustices people of colour live with every day, we are told change is coming. When London elected the first 3 black MPs 33 years ago, they said change was coming. When the Macpherson inquiry was published 21 years ago after the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, they said change was coming. But black people are 8 times more likely to be tasered by the police. We heard earlier from the exchange between Assembly Member Eshalomi and the Mayor about the disproportionality in the Met stop and search figures for men of BAME heritage. Little wonder that I am left asking the question of the Police Commissioner, is unconscious bias at play within your force? Are your officers profiling young black men? When the Labour government passed the Equality Act in 2010, they said change was coming. But despite that, and despite the fact that black people appear to have a degree, people of BAME heritage are twice as likely to be unemployed. When 9 in 10 of the victims of Grenfell Tower fire were non-white or non-UK nationals, they said change was coming. But it took until this year for the last family left in homelessness by that fire to be moved out of a hotel. The survivors and families of the deceased and the bereaved are still fighting frustrating battles, calling for justice for Grenfell. When the Windrush scandal shamed the Tory government into admitting it had deported innocent people, they said change was coming. This is an issue close to my heart because I am a daughter of the Windrush generation and I have witnessed firsthand the pain and distress experienced by many innocent British subjects who, after a lifetime of living, contributing and being faithful to the motherland, as they call it, were told you are not welcomed here. Colleagues, do you realise that there are 30 recommendations for the Home Office to implement before we can claim to have learned from what was done to those elders? When Public Health England eventually published its report into racial inequalities in coronavirus, it told us nothing new, but they still said change was coming. Chair, in summary, let me say, I am sick and tired of being told change is coming. If the change promised to those who Martin Luther King Jr. died for had taken place in the US, then the white police officer would not have kept his knee on the neck of a black man for 9 minutes. George Floyd's last words would not have been, "I can't breathe." What has this got to do with us, you may say? Colleagues, can I assure you that it has everything to do with us, as more than one black man has said those very same words on their dying breaths on the streets of London. I repeat, racism infects all parts of our society. We must commit to be allies and work in solidarity to stamp it out. As David Lammy said so passionately the other day to Boris Johnson in the House of Commons, you're in government, do something. I want to celebrate the progress that has been made. Hope is vital. Looking at what we have achieved, despite the odds, shows us that things can be different. They must be different. Let this latest round of call for justice and a chance to breathe. So ably led by the Black Lives Matter movement, be the moment that means change really is coming. Let us as an assembly play our part. Colleagues, please support this motion. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I am allowing a bit of latitude in terms of time limit, but please, if you can, try and finish this very, very important debate within the allocated time of 5 minutes. Can I now, from my list I've been given, invite Assemblymember Gavran, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Well, I felt I must speak out to this motion. The horror of the death of George Floyd and the protests that followed it have made it incumbent, I think, on us as white people to understand and recognize the racism in our systems, in our policies, in our institutions, and to speak out on this issue and to educate ourselves and to act. Now, I recognize, and it's already been reinforced by the two previous speakers who spoke so eloquently, that it's a multi-dimensional issue. But I just wanted to speak from the point of someone who's been in planning and politics for several decades and just speak through the prism of housing. I've seen over about 30 years an increasingly broken housing system which impacts disproportionately on our communities, which are Black, Asian and ethnic minorities. And COVID-19 has only amplified this. We've heard in the last few years how overcrowding in the public and private rented sector has broken all previous records. How, and that's across all those 10 years, how there are for every 5 families, there are 5 more families in overcrowded conditions than there are white families, Black families. And also that Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities are more likely to be multi-generational in their family housing and therefore to need larger houses. Now, larger houses are unaffordable. And we know that public housing has been diminishing, eroded, sold off. We know that subsidies have dwindled. And we know that the grant system, threadbare as it is, can't allow anymore, or hardly allows, for family housing to be built. This forces Black and minority ethnic families into cramped and substandard conditions. There are major inequalities here. We've talked about the correlation between COVID and BAME communities, but in health, mental and physical health, in education, social, economic. And I'm talking about housing, but it's only one facet. This is one facet of systemic racism. But in the housing system, in the housing market, there's more blatant discrimination. Take the right to rent. This is the fact that all landlords and letting agents ask prospective tenants for their immigration status. It's a central plank of the hostile environment. And after case of landlords and letting agents turning away Black and minority ethnic families from properties, only to then allow viewing and lettings to white families. The High Court ruled this unlawful and discriminatory. Shockingly, this year, the government overturned that decision and the policy remains. We must seize the moment. We must use the energy and the anger of those crowds that are protesting. And we must use it because they're saying to us, enough is enough. We need to scrutinise and reform our housing policies because they are so central to so many agendas and they impact so negatively, profoundly negatively, on the lives of Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. This must change, which is why I'm speaking in this way to this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Gavron. The next one on the list is Assemblymember Qureshi. Can't hear you.
Okay. Sorry,
Yeah.
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. My last trip to the States was at my departure from the London Assembly in 2016 to the funeral of the greatest, Muhammad Ali. And to all intents and purposes, today I could not make the same trip in Trump's America. He's pushed the Muslim travel ban, he's blaming the Chinese for everything, and has shown complete indifference on the treatment of African Americans in these recent episodes. And it's not only the nature and the manner of George Floyd's killing that is troubling, but the reality is this has been a regular occurrence in the States for year on year, decades and even centuries, some would suggest. And I think Will Smith, the actor, wraps up quite clearly. Nothing's really changed except it's filmed now. We've got our mobiles, we can take pictures, we can relay it around much quicker than ever. News gets around much quickly on social media. So it's understandable that Black communities in the UK make parallels. For example, in Chicago, 70% of the fatalities there actually come from only 30% of the African American community in Chicago. In the UK, we have similar figures. COVID deaths are 4 times more likely amongst Black adults than those amongst white ethnicity, as stated by the Office of National Statistics. What is also more disturbing is some of the policing elements during COVID-19. Only last night on Channel 4, it was reported that parts of England and Wales, you're 6 times more likely to be fined if you're a BAME person in lockdown. Actually, in London, it's not as bad as that. It's about twice. But nonetheless, it shows very clearly how people are feeling in the present circumstances. And if anything, our work as Assembly members must play a role in ensuring that racism and discrimination is challenged and eradicated. That's why I'll be voting for this motion, and also I will take the knee during this vote, unlike national leaders up and down this country at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assemblymember Qureshi. Next one on the list is Assemblymember Barry.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to my Assembly colleagues, Assemblymember Arnold and Assemblymember Sahota, for their amendment to this motion today. I wish to speak on behalf of myself and my Green colleague, Caroline Russell, to condemn the murder of George Floyd and support Black Lives Matter, as this motion does. We know that the crisis of the coronavirus pandemic has exposed more sharply than ever the huge inequality built into our society, and exposed again the extent to which racism is a crisis too. The kind of far-right, explicit, violent racism we saw last weekend on our streets is only a small minority of people as a whole, but it was clearly not a small minority of those attending, as the Home Secretary claimed. But beyond these disgusting scenes of organised far-right aggression, institutional racism and prejudice is still woven through our society, and its threads must be systematically pulled out of our education and welfare systems, out of our housing market, out of our workplaces, out of our police forces, and out of our everyday lives. And it's very, very important that we recognise that that racist policies are not just a historical problem. Relatively new policies like the hostile environment, housing and development policies that act to push poorer and minority Londoners out of their communities or leave them in unsafe homes, and brand new technologies like facial recognition are being written and enacted in the present day that make biases and inequality worse and cement institutional racism further into our society. I absolutely agree with what this motion says, that it is our job as Assembly members to challenge policies like these, to stand together with Black Londoners and to play our role in ensuring all racism and discrimination is eradicated. We have much work to do to get there, but we have a chance now to make real and lasting changes in a better direction. I'm very happy to support this amendment on behalf of my group and to join our colleagues in pledging to be actively anti-racist in our work here together. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Next one is Assembly Member Pigeon, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I welcome and totally back this amendment brought before us today from Assembly Members Sahota and Arnold, and they spoke very passionately earlier indeed. There are very serious issues that the Black Lives Matter campaign has highlighted and brought right up the agenda. And there are deep, entrenched and historical inequalities in our society. However, I think COVID has been the clearest issue which shows disproportionality and the impact on our BAME communities. You've only got to look at the death toll from COVID for NHS and social care staff or transport workers, particularly frontline bus drivers, to see that. And I personally found it staggering that the NHS self-reporting website for people who'd had COVID was not even recording ethnicity. It's an issue that I highlighted with Deputy Mayor Fiona Twycross right back in April, who I knew took up the issue straight away because she was as appalled as I was. But I'm really pleased this motion refers to us as Assembly members, and I think that's critical because one message that's coming through now is that action is needed, not just reviews. We need to look through our committee work again at the record of things like stop and search in London. We need to, as Assembly Member Berry has just highlighted, look again at the use of facial recognition technology by the Met. We need to be looking at the diversity of our workforce, of the Met and all the other organisations across the GLA group. And we need to be looking at things like the impact of air pollution on particular communities in London. So I hope we can pass this motion today. I hope we can pass it unanimously. But let us all get together, act straight away and work on these issues to improve the lives for BAME Londoners. Thank you very much indeed, Chair.
Thank you. Next one on the list is Assembly Member Andrew Buff.
London is the most diverse city on the planet, and its strength comes from that. And as has just been referred to by Caroline Pigeon, we need to all work together and act together in order to fight this curse of racism and discrimination. Because it exists in this city, it isn't just something that is a foreign problem, and we need to take action here. It makes you wonder, therefore, that if the proposers of the motion cared so much about the issue and working together, you would have thought that they would have included other parties in advance of the meeting, rather than 1 hour, 37 minutes after its start. As the other members have stated, the number of COVID deaths amongst BAME people is disproportionately high. So why don't we, as a part of our statement, as a part of this worthy statement that we're putting out, highlight the fact that it beggars belief that despite knowing what we have learned during the pandemic about the disproportionate effect on ethnic minorities of the COVID virus and the disproportionate number of ethnic BAME people in overcrowding conditions, that we have a mayor who this very day has refused to review his housing and planning policies in that light. Apparently, his policies anticipated the virus and need no amendment. This is clearly ridiculous, and it's clearly letting down the BAME Londoners who are disproportionately affected by overcrowding? Why, for instance, does this motion not specifically mention things that we can do? For example, the very, very slow progress there has been in the MPS and TfL in name-blind recruiting. Years on from this being raised by the Assembly, we still have a situation where virtually no name-blind recruiting takes place within TfL, and the MPS come up with excuses for not having it. Yes, we should all work together, but this motion would have been a damn sight better if you'd have incorporated all Assembly members rather than ones who you just think are your political mates. Thank you.
Right, next one is Assembly Member Hall, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not surprised at the passion I hear from my colleague Andrew Boff, and I agree he won't be surprised with everything he said. But I am actually quite surprised about this motion. The first surprise was a rather clumsy personal dig at, let's be honest, it was me, from Assembly Member Sahota when he proposed the motion. I don't think that was necessary, and indeed it cheapens what this is supposed to be all about. Because while I might differ in some of the language you've used on it, fundamentally it's a motion about tackling all inequalities, something COVID has really highlighted in relation to health and ensuring fairness, tackling racism and making sure that people have a voice. And for those, and I absolutely agree with that. So on that basis, I will absolutely be supporting the motion. I also have to say that I was a little surprised to see that the motion popped up mid-meeting. I don't recall that ever happening since I've been an Assembly member for the last 3 years. I understand from longer-serving colleagues that this was an agreement that sudden motions like this were a thing of the past. I'm thoroughly disappointed. I'm also disappointed, as mentioned by Assembly Member Boff, that other groups appeared to know nothing as well. I don't think the BAG group knew about it. It's disappointing that this is what you think is acceptable. It may be not that it was not for a long time, but Sian mentioned talking about it before we'd even had sight of it. And she did that on the WhatsApp group. We're not monsters, you can talk to us. Very often we do agree with what you're saying. We don't like your wording, but we agree with a lot of what you do. Despite what some of you think, we are not monsters. We actually feel far more than you would give us credit for. It cheapens the motion that you just fling it upon us, and keeping it from us is totally disgraceful. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Let's move on to Assembly Member Bailey, please.
Thank you, Chair. As you can see by looking down the camera, I have a very big vested interest in a motion such as this. But unfortunately, my two previous colleagues are correct, because this is a problem for the entire country, in many respects a challenge for the entire world. And one of the reasons we haven't made progress on this for hundreds of years is people playing politics. If we're serious about serving black communities in this city and in this country, we should be doing this together. Yes, there is many things that we can do as Assembly around the technicalities of law and delivery, and we can push Parliament to do. But ultimately, this is an issue of hearts and minds. This is about how people view me when I walk into a coffee shop. This is about how my son will look for a job in the future. This will be about my daughter. Will she ever feel safe? Or will she be tired, like the young woman who spoke to us in the vigil that the chair organised? She used the word tired. And today I feel tired because this is correct. It is right. Black people have been calling for this for hundreds and hundreds of years. And instead of us coming together as Assembly and landing something powerfully to add to the weight of this argument, this irresistible argument, we've done it in such a way that it's cheapened its effect. And I really want to get across to you just how live this issue is. Whilst I've been sat in Mayor's Question Time, I have received a hugely racist email. I won't bore you with the vagaries, but just to say it ends with "go back to my mud hut." Racism exists. We all know that. It exists in people's hearts. It exists in policy. It exists in institutions. And if we are to hold our heads high as a group of professional politicians, we must do this together. People are calling for change. Change is always difficult. And if we are to lead that change, we must do it together. So while I will be supporting this motion, I absolutely will, I still think it could have been done in a better way. And I hope as an assembly, when we take this issue on, we tackle it together. Because we have something that's proposed by our mayor, which I worry will cause a tremendous amount of problems in community. And it's this thing about looking at statues and name plaques. It's great when you remove a slaver that we can all agree on. But what are we going to do when someone wants to remove one of your heroes? And they have a justifiable reason for that. You are going to see massive wedges pushed between communities. And if we behave in the way that this was launched this morning, we will be adding to that wedge. And I know all of you, I'm pretty sure you would want to do this properly and not add to the problems. So one more time, these issues are live for Londoners, have been for hundreds of years. We as an assembly can do something historic here to ease this issue, but only if we do it together. We have to bring people with us. There's people on the other side of the argument who believe what they believe. We have to convince. The way we've done this morning would make that harder. So while I will be supporting it, please, please, can we not turn this into political chess? Can we please not try to attach our other political wants to this? This is a plea from the black community to do this only around solving the issues of racism for black people and not around selling other people's individual politics. Thank you, Chair.
Right, thank you very much, Assembly Member Bailey. The last one on the list I have in front of me is Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. I will be brief, and I wasn't really planning to speak at first, but I just want to put this debate in a historical context. But let me start by saying about last night, there was a powerful interview on Newsnight from a black gay ex-police officer recounting his painful experiences as a serving police officer. His career suffered. I believe that he made about 44 complaints. We had Janet Hills of the Black Police Officers Association on television earlier in the week talking about the problems she and her colleagues are facing. We've had stories over the last 2 weeks in the press about police officers speaking out about their personal experiences of racism, how it's blighted their promotion chances, and so on. But look, these are not new issues. So when I talk about historical context, I remember marching in Hackney with people demanding justice for Colin Roach's family. Colin Roach died in Stoke Newington police station in the early 80s in very mysterious circumstances. There was an inquiry, public inquiry supported by Hackney Council into the death of Colin Roach. A major report with recommendations came out. Hackney Council went as far as taking a position, calling upon other councils to withhold the police precept. Let me make it very clear, by the way, I don't believe in this defunding the police stuff. So let me be very, very clear about that. It was a serious enough issue for a council to take that position. We had the Broadwater Farm inquiry. All this was before Macpherson. The debate did not start with Macpherson. We had issues in my constituency, Newham, Tower Hamlets. There were numerous campaigns around police accountability, the way the police treated black communities in terms of racist attacks. We had self-defense campaigns. And this pamphlet, this book rather, Policing Against Black People by the Institute of Race Relations, that came out in 1987. So these are, as I say, not new issues. So where do we go from here? I believe progress has been made. It would be churlish not to say that progress hasn't been made, but has it been made with the speed with which it needs to be made? The answer is no. We have mountains to climb still. And this is where I think the Black Lives Movement has brought these issues to the fore. Of course, everyone's life has got to be valued, but you cannot talk about all lives matter with conviction and believe in it if one section of a community is not treated equally. And that is the message of the central message coming out from the Black Lives Movement. Not demanding special treatments, but it's just demanding basic equality. So we've had, let's say, 7 reviews in the last few years, but as David Lammy said very eloquently, get on with it, implement those recommendations. And of course, we've got our role to play the GLA, where through the police committee, we will be pursuing issues of disproportionality in a very robust manner. And of course, it's got to be on all-party basis. So I welcome the government's commission. I know some people have dismissed it. I said a few years ago that we have never had a nationally led race equality strategy in this country. If we get one coming out from this particular commission sponsored by the government, then I believe we can dismantle institutional barriers and institutional racism within a decade as much as it's possible. So yes, let's get on with it. But this, as I say, we've had numerous inquiries. It's time, more than time for action, and just get on with it, as David Lemmy said. Thank you, Chair.
Right, thank you very much. Dr. Assembly Member Sahota, do you want to sum up or well, respond to the debate?
Well, I do, Chair, if I may, please. Now, first of all, I want to thank all Assembly members who've spoken in favour of this and so passionately. But I do think I need to address two questions. One, of course, the purpose of this motion was because the Assembly has remained silent so far. I have my in-post mails saying to me, Dr. Sahota, why have you not spoken up on this matter? Why have we not heard anything from the London Assembly about this matter? And when I heard that the mayor, that the chair, tried to put up a statement on behalf of the Assembly, but his hands were tied behind his back, I felt that we needed to do something. And this was the first opportunity of us speaking collectively as an Assembly to Londoners, to the world, that these matters are of concern to us, that those demonstrations have not fallen on deaf or blind eyes, that we do care for them. So this is why this had to come. It isn't the first time that a motion has been amended. It's happened a number of times. And I've seen this, and maybe I've been here longer in the Assembly than other Assembly members, but I've seen this happen repeatedly. This is not a unheard of, but this was the first opportunity we had of doing something. And if we hadn't done something on this occasion, question would be asked, where were you? Were you listening? Were you seeing? Where is the voice of Londoners? And therefore I have no apology to make, no apology whatsoever for introducing this motion this morning at this time and the way I've done it. Because there was enough opportunity to the Assembly to speak with one voice under the chair of the Assembly, and that opportunity was missed. And therefore I need to put this into the public domain, that these matters did matter to us. And I think it's very important that do we speak out with a single voice and collectively. And I hope that all of you will rally behind this motion. The second thing is, this motion is only drawing attention to the voice. The work on individual projects will be done in the various committees. And Mr. Chair, with your approval, if I just can highlight that the Health Committee is meeting next Thursday to look at the inequalities in terms of health on COVID, or what the BME community is affected, and how we can make recommendations. So we are to take this work forward in our various committees. And this motion is not in lieu of that. It's not instead of that. This is to give you that license, to give people the initiative, and to give the authority to do that work. So that's another thing. And the language, well, some of the language is taken exactly, had been taken from the speeches of the Prime Minister. This is not toxic language. This is language used by the Prime Minister himself. This was a language intended to rally the Tory party, to rally the Liberal Democrat, to rally the Greens, to rally the Labour Party, and to rally all of us behind a national call. This language is not inflammatory. The language of this motion comes exactly and entirely from the speeches of the Prime Minister. And I hope that you will note that also. So I hope that none of you have the excuse to vote against this. I hope none of you have the opportunity of voting against it. This is to unite behind the cause that Black lives do matter to us. We care passionately for it, and that you will be listening to Londoners, and we are speaking with one voice to hear their concerns. And so, Chair, I move this motion.
Thank you very much. Colleague Assembly Member, we had a decent debate. I thank everyone for that. Let's move on to the vote on the amendment. Having listened to the contributions, I don't believe that there's a general consent. I will still try. Is there a general consent in favor of this motion?
Agreed.
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 Is that unanimous?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Well, I'm pleased therefore to declare that the amendment to the motion is carried unanimously. Thank you very much for the debate and the conclusion.
Do the motion as well.
That brings us to the date of next meeting. The next.
Mr. Chairman, you need to do the motion.
Yes, indeed. Sorry. Can we agree to the substantive motion amending my original motion from the chair? Can we agree to the substantive motion? Unanimously? Thank you. Right. Let's now move on to the last item on the agenda, last but one, date of next meeting. The next scheduled meeting of the London Assembly will be the Mayor's Question Time meeting, which will take place as a virtual meeting at 10 o'clock on Thursday, 16th of July. And the final item on the agenda is any other business which I consider urgent. There is no urgent business requiring consideration, so I end this Mayor's Question Time meeting today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.